Section 0. Preface to Therese Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bologna Times. Therese Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vistelli. Preface. This volume, Therese Raquin, was Zola's third book, but it was the one that first gave him notoriety, and made him somebody, as the saying goes. While still a clerk at Hatchett's at £8 a month, engaged in checking and perusing advertisements and press notices, he had already in 1864 published the first series of Les Contes et Nignons, a reprint of short stories contributed to various publications, and in the following year had brought out La Confession de Claude. Both these books were issued by La Croix, a famous go-ahead publisher and bookseller in those days, whose place of business stood at one end of the corners of the Rue Vivienne and the Boulevard Montmartre, and who at La Croix, Verboeckhoven, et Cie, ended in bankruptcy in the early '70s. La Confession de Claude met with poor appreciation from the general public, though it attracted the attention of the public prosecutor, who sent down to Hachette's to make a few inquiries about the author, but went no further. When, however, M. Barré d'Aurevilly, in a critical weekly paper called the Nagent, spitefully alluded to this rather daring novel as Hachette's little book, one of the members of the firm sent for M. Zola and addressed him thus: "Look here, M. Zola, you are earning £8 a month with us, which is ridiculous for a man of your talent. Why don't you go into literature altogether? It will bring you wealth and glory." Zola had no choice but to take this broad hint, and sent in his resignation, which was at once accepted. The Hachettes did not require the services of writers of risky, or, for that matter, any other novels, as clerks. And besides, as Zola had told us himself, in an interview with my old friend and employer, the late M. Ferrand Zal, editor of the Paris journal, they thought La Confession de Claude a trifle stiff, and objected to their clerks writing books in time which they considered theirs, as they paid for it. Quote, "He sent me to Hamburg for 10 days in 1892 to report on the appalling outbreak of cholera in that city, with the emoluments of £10 a day, besides printing several articles from my pen on Parisian topics. E.V." Unquote. Zola, cast, so to say, adrift with Les Contes et Nignons and Les Confessions de Claude as scant literary baggage, buckled to and set about Les Mystères de Marseille and Therese Raquin, while at the same time contributing art criticisms to the Événement, a series of articles which raised such a storm that painters and sculptors were in the habit of purchasing copies of the paper and tearing it up in the faces of Zola and de Villemessant, the owner, whenever they chanced to meet them. Nevertheless, it was these articles that first drew attention to Manet, who had hitherto been regarded as a painter of no account, and many of whose pictures now hang in the Luxembourg Gallery. Therese Raquin originally came out under the title of A Love Story, in a paper called The Artiste, edited by that famous art critic and courtier of the Second Empire, Arsène Houssaye, author of Les Grandes Dames, as well as of those charming volumes Hommes et Femmes, 18e siècle, and many other works. Zola received no more than £24 for the serial rights of the novel, and he consented at the insistence of the editor, who pointed out to him that the periodical was read by the Empress Eugénie, to draw his pen through certain passages, which were reinstated when the story was published in volume form. I may say here that in this translation I have adopted the views of the late M. Arsène Houssaye, and if I have allowed the appalling description of the Paris morgue to stand, it is first of all, because it constitutes a very important factor in the story. And, moreover, it is so graphic, so true to life, as I have seen the place myself, times out of number, that notwithstanding its horror, it really would be a loss to pass it over. Well, Therese Raquin, having appeared as a love story in The Artiste, was then published as a book, in 1867, by that same Lacroix as had issued Zola's preceding efforts in novel writing. I was living in Paris at the time, and I well recall the yell of disapprobation with which the volume was received by the reviewers. Louis Ulbach, then a writer on the Figaro, to which Zola also contributed, and who subsequently founded and edited a paper called La Cloche, when Zola, curiously enough, became one of his critics, made a particularly virulent attack on the novel and its author. Henri de Villemessant, the editor, authorized Zola to reply to him, with the result that a vehement discussion ensued in print between author and critic, and Therese Raquin promptly went into a second edition, to which Zola appended a preface. I have not thought it necessary to translate this preface, which is a long and rather tedious reply to the reviewers of the day. It will suffice to say, briefly, that the author meets the strictures of his critics by pointing out and insisting on the fact that he has simply sought to make an analytic study of temperament and not of character. I have selected persons, says he, absolutely swayed by their nerves and blood, deprived of free will, impelled in every action of life by the fatal lusts of the flesh. Thérèse and Laurent are human brutes, nothing more. I have sought to follow these brutes step by step in the secret labor of their passions, in the impulsion of their instincts, in the cerebral disorder resulting from the excessive strain on their nerves. Edward Vistelli, Surbiton, 1 December 1901. End of preface.
Chapter 1 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 1. At the end of the Rue Guénégaud, coming from the quays, you find the Arcade of the Pont Neuf, a sort of narrow, dark corridor running from the Rue Mazarine to the Rue de Seine. This arcade, at the most, is 30 paces long by 2 in breadth. It is paved with worn, loose, yellowish tiles which are never free from acrid damp. The square panes of glass forming the roof are black with filth. On fine days in the summer, when the streets are burning with heavy sun, whitish light falls from the dirty glazing overhead to drag miserably through the arcade. On nasty days in winter, on foggy mornings, the glass throws nothing but darkness on the sticky tiles, unclean and abominable gloom. To the left are obscure, low, dumpy shops, whence issue puffs of air as cold as if coming from a cellar. Here are dealers in toys, cardboard boxes, second-hand books. The articles displayed in their windows are covered with dust, and owing to the prevailing darkness can only be perceived indistinctly. The shop fronts, formed of small panes of glass, streak the goods with a peculiar greenish reflex. Beyond, behind the display in the windows, the dim interiors resemble a number of lugubrious cavities animated by fantastic forms. To the right, along the whole length of the arcade, extends a wall against which the shopkeepers opposite have stuck some small cupboards. Objects without a name, goods forgotten for 20 years, are spread out there on thin shelves painted a horrible brown color. A dealer in imitation jewelry has set up shop in one of these cupboards, and there sells 15-sou rings, delicately set out on a cushion of blue velvet at the bottom of a mahogany box. Above the glazed cupboards ascends the roughly plastered black wall, looking as if covered with leprosy, and all seamed with defacements. The Arcade of the Pont Neuf is not a place for a stroll. You take it to make a short cut, to gain a few minutes. It is traversed by busy people whose sole aim is to go quick and straight before them. You see apprentices there in their working aprons, work girls taking home their work, persons of both sexes with parcels under their arms. There are also old men who drag themselves forward in the sad gloaming that falls from the glazed roof, and bands of small children who come to the arcade on leaving school to make a noise by stamping their feet on the tiles as they run along. Throughout the day a sharp hurried ring of footsteps resounds on the stone with irritating irregularity. Nobody speaks, nobody stays there, all hurry about their business with bent heads, stepping out rapidly without taking a single glance at the shops. The tradesmen observe with an air of alarm the passers-by who, by a miracle, stop before their windows. The arcade is lit at night by 3 gas-burners enclosed in heavy square lanterns. These jets of gas, hanging from the glazed roof whereon they cast spots of fawn-colored light, shed around them circles of pale glimmer that seem at moments to disappear. The arcade now assumes the aspect of a regular cut-throat alley. Great shadows stretch along the tiles, damp puffs of air enter from the street. Any one might take the place for a subterranean gallery, indistinctly lit up by 3 funeral lamps. The tradespeople for all light are contented with the faint rays which the gas burners throw upon their windows. Inside their shops they merely have a lamp with a shade, which they place at the corner of their counter, and the passer-by can then distinguish what the depths of these holes, sheltering night in the daytime, contain. On this blackish line of shop fronts the windows of a cardboard box maker are flaming. 2 schist lamps pierce the shadow with a couple of yellow flames. And on the other side of that arcade a candle, stuck in the middle of an argand lamp-glass, casts glistening stars into the box of imitation jewellery. The dealer is dozing in her cupboard with her hands hidden under her shawl. A few years back, opposite this dealer, stood a shop whose bottle-green woodwork excreted damp by all its cracks. On the signboard, made of a long narrow plank, figured, in black letters, the word "Mercery." And on one of the panes of glass in the door was written, in red, the name of a woman, Thérèse Raquin. To right and left were deep showcases lined with blue paper. During the daytime the eye could only distinguish the display of goods in a soft, obscured light. On one side were a few linen articles, crimped tulle caps, at 2 and 3 francs apiece, muslin sleeves and collars. Then undervests, stockings, socks, braces. Each article had grown yellow and crumpled, and hung lamentably suspended from a wire hook. The window, from top to bottom, was filled in this manner with whitish bits of clothing, which took a lugubrious aspect in the transparent obscurity. The new caps, of brighter whiteness, formed hollow spots on the blue paper covering the shelves, and the coloured socks hanging on an iron rod contributed sombre notes to the livid and vague effacement of the muslin. On the other side, in a narrower showcase, were piled up large balls of green wool, white cards of black buttons, boxes of all colours and sizes, hair nets ornamented with steel beads, spread over rounds of bluish paper, fasces of knitting needles, tapestry patterns, bobbins of ribbon, along with a heap of soiled and faded articles, which doubtless had been lying in the same place for 5 or 6 years. All the tints had turned dirty grey in this cupboard, rotting with dust and damp. In summer, towards noon, when the sun scorched the squares and streets with its tawny rays, you could distinguish, behind the caps in the other window, the pale, grave profile of a young woman. This profile issued vaguely from the darkness reigning in the shop. To a low parched forehead was attached a long, narrow, pointed nose. The pale pink lips resembled 2 thin threads, and the short, nervy chin was attached to the neck by a line that was supple and fat. The body, lost in the shadow, could not be seen. The profile alone appeared in its olive whiteness, perforated by a large, wide open black eye, and as though crushed beneath thick dark hair. This profile remained there for hours, motionless and peaceful, between a couple of caps for women, whereon the damp iron rods had imprinted bands of rust. all night, when the lamp had been lit, you could see inside the shop, which was greater in length than depth. At one end stood a small counter. At the other, a corkscrew staircase afforded communication with the rooms on the first floor. Against the walls were showcases, cupboards, rows of green cardboard boxes. 4 chairs and a table completed the furniture. The shop looked bare and frigid. The goods were done up in parcels and put away in corners instead of lying hither and thither in a joyous display of color. As a rule, 2 women were seated behind the counter, the young woman with the grave profile, and an old lady who sat dozing with a smile on her countenance. The latter was about 60, and her fat, placid face looked white in the brightness of the lamp. A great tabby cat, crouching at a corner of the counter, watched her as she slept. Lower down, on a chair, a man of 30 sat reading or chatting in a subdued voice with the young woman. He was short, delicate, and in manner languid. With his fair hair devoid of lustre, his sparse beard, his face covered with red blotches, he resembled a sickly, spoilt child arrived at manhood. Shortly before 10 o'clock the old lady awoke. The shop was then closed, and all the family went upstairs to bed. The tabby cat followed the party, purring, and rubbing its head against each bar of the banisters. The lodging above comprised 3 apartments. The staircase led to a dining room, which also did duty as drawing room. In a niche on the left stood a porcelain stove. Opposite, a sideboard. Then chairs were ranged along the walls, and a round table occupied the centre. At the further end a glazed partition concealed a dark kitchen. On each side of the dining room was a sleeping apartment. The old lady, after kissing her son and daughter-in-law, withdrew. The cat went to sleep on a chair in the kitchen. The married couple entered their room, which had a second door opening on a staircase that communicated with the arcade by an obscure, narrow passage. The husband, who was always trembling with fever, went to bed, while the young woman opened the window to close the shutter blinds. She remained there a few minutes facing the great black wall which ascends and stretches above the arcade. She cast a vague, wandering look upon this wall, and, without a word, she, in her turn, went to bed in disdainful indifference. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 2. Madame Raquin had formerly been a mercer at Vernon. For close upon 25 years she had kept a small shop in that town. A few years after the death of her husband, becoming subject to fits of faintness, she sold her business. Her savings added to the price of this sale placed a capital of 40,000 francs in her hand, which she invested so that it brought her in an income of 2,000 francs a year. This sum amply sufficed for her requirements. She led the life of a recluse. Ignoring the poignant joys and cares of this world, she arranged for herself a tranquil existence of peace and happiness. At an annual rental of 400 francs, she took a small house with a garden descending to the edge of the Seine. This enclosed, quiet residence vaguely recalled the cloister. It stood in the centre of large fields, and was approached by a narrow path. The windows of the dwelling opened to the river and to the solitary hillocks on the opposite bank. The good lady, who had passed the half-century, shut herself up in this solitary retreat, where along with her son Camille and her niece Theresa, she partook of serene joy. Although Camille was then 20, his mother continued to spoil him like a little child. She adored him because she had shielded him from death throughout a tedious childhood of constant suffering. The boy contracted every fever, every imaginable malady, one after the other. Madame Raquin struggled for 15 years against these terrible evils, which arrived in rapid succession to tear her son away from her. She vanquished them all by patience, care, and adoration. Camille, having grown up, rescued from death, had contracted a shiver from the torture of the repeated shocks he had undergone. Arrested in his growth, he remained short and delicate. His long, thin limbs moved slowly and wearily. But his mother loved him all the more on account of this weakness that arched his back. She observed his thin, pale face with triumphant tenderness when she thought of how she had brought him back to life more than 10 times over. During the brief spaces of repose that his sufferings allowed him, the child attended a commercial school at Vernon. There he learned orthography and arithmetic. His science was limited to the 4 rules and a very superficial knowledge of grammar. Later on he took lessons in writing and bookkeeping. Madame Raquin began to tremble when advised to send her son to college. She knew he would die if separated from her, and she said the books would kill him. So Camille remained ignorant, and this ignorance seemed to increase his weakness. At 18, having nothing to do, bored to death at the delicate attention of his mother, he took a situation as clerk with a linen merchant, where he earned 60 francs a month. Being of a restless nature, idleness proved unbearable. He found greater calm and better health in this labor of a brute, which kept him bent all day long over invoices, over enormous additions, each figure of which he patiently added up. At night, broken down with fatigue, without an idea in his head, he enjoyed infinite delight in the doltishness which settled on him. He had to quarrel with his mother to go with the dealer in linen. She wanted to keep him always with her, between a couple of blankets, far from the accidents of life. But the young man spoke as master. He claimed work as children claim toys, not from a feeling of duty, but by instinct, by a necessity of nature. The tenderness, the devotedness of his mother had instilled into him an egotism which was ferocious. He fancied he loved those who pitied and caressed him, but in reality he lived apart, within himself, loving naught but his comfort, seeking by all possible means to increase his enjoyment. When the tender affection of Madame Raquin disgusted him, he plunged with delight into a stupid occupation that saved him from infusions and potions. In the evening, on his return from the office, he ran to the bank of the Seine with his cousin Thérèse, who was then close upon 18. One day, 16 years previously, while Madame Raquin was still a mercer, her brother Captain Degans brought her a little girl in his arms. He had just arrived from Algeria. "Here is a child," said he, with a smile, "and you are her aunt. The mother is dead, and I don't know what to do with her. I'll give her to you." The mercer took the child, smiled at her, and kissed her rosy cheeks. Although Degans remained a week at Vernon, his sister barely put a question to him concerning the little girl he had brought her. She understood vaguely that the dear little creature was born at Oran, and that her mother was a woman of the country of great beauty. The captain, an hour before his departure, handed his sister a certificate of birth in which Thérèse, acknowledged by him to be his child, bore his name. He rejoined his regiment and was never seen again at Vernon, being killed a few years later in Africa. Thérèse grew up under the fostering care of her aunt, sleeping in the same bed as Camille. She, who had an iron constitution, received the treatment of a delicate child, partaking of the same medicine as her cousin, and kept in the warm air of the room occupied by the invalid. For hours she remained crouching over the fire, in thought, watching the flames before her, without lowering her eyelids. This obligatory life of a convalescent caused her to retire within herself. She got into the habit of talking in a low voice, of moving about noiselessly, of remaining mute and motionless on a chair with expressionless open eyes. But when she raised an arm, when she advanced a foot, it was easy to perceive that she possessed feline suppleness, short, potent muscles, and that unmistakable energy and passion slumbered in her soporous frame. Her cousin having fallen down one day in a fainting fit, she abruptly picked him up and carried him, an effort of strength that turned her cheeks scarlet. The cloistered life she led, the debilitating regimen to which she found herself subjected, failed to weaken her thin, robust form. Only her face took a pale and even a slightly yellowish tint, making her look almost ugly in the shade. Ever and anon she went to the window and contemplated the opposite houses on which the sun threw sheets of gold. When Madame Raquin sold her business and withdrew to the little place beside the river, Thérèse experienced secret thrills of joy. Her aunt had so frequently repeated to her, "Don't make a noise, be quiet," that she kept all the impetuosity of her nature carefully concealed within her. She possessed supreme composure and an apparent tranquillity that masked terrible transports. She still fancied herself in the room of her cousin beside a dying child, and had the softened movements, the periods of silence, the placidity, the faltering speech of an old woman. When she saw the garden, the clear river, the vast green hillocks ascending on the horizon, she felt a savage desire to run and shout. She felt her heart thumping fit to burst in her bosom. But not a muscle of her face moved, and she merely smiled when her aunt inquired whether she was pleased with her new home. Life now became more pleasant for her. She maintained her supple gait, her calm, indifferent countenance. She remained the child brought up in the bed of an invalid, but inwardly she lived in a burning, passionate existence. When alone on the grass beside the water, she would lie down flat on her stomach like an animal, her black eyes wide open, her body writhing, ready to spring. And she stayed there for hours, without a thought, scorched by the sun, delighted at being able to thrust her fingers in the earth. She had the most ridiculous dreams. She looked at the roaring river in defiance, imagining that the water was about to leap on her and attack her. Then she became rigid, preparing for the defense, and angrily inquiring of herself how she could vanquish the torrent. At night, Thérèse, appeased and silent, stitched beside her aunt, with a countenance that seemed to be dozing in the gleam that softly glided from beneath the lamp shade. Camille, buried in an armchair, thought of his additions. A word uttered in a low voice alone disturbed, at moments, the peacefulness of this drowsy home. Madame Raquin observed her children with serene benevolence. She had resolved to make them husband and wife. She continued to treat her son as if he were at death's door, and she trembled when she happened to reflect that she would one day die herself, and would leave him alone and suffering. In that contingency she relied on Thérèse, saying to herself that the young girl would be a vigilant guardian beside Camille. Her niece, with her tranquil manner and mute devotedness, inspired her with unlimited confidence. She had seen Thérèse at work, and wished to give her to her son as a guardian angel. This marriage was a solution to the matter, foreseen and settled in her mind. The children knew for a long time that they were one day to marry. They had grown up with this idea, which had thus become familiar and natural to them. The union was spoken of in the family as a necessary and positive thing. Madame Raquin had said, "We will wait until Thérèse is 21." And they waited patiently, without excitement, and without a blush. Camille, whose blood had become impoverished by illness, had remained a little boy in the eyes of his cousin. He kissed her as he kissed his mother, by habit, without losing any of his egotistic tranquillity. He looked upon her as an obliging comrade who helped him to amuse himself, and who, if occasion offered, prepared him an infusion. When playing with her, when he held her in his arms, it was as if he had a boy to deal with. He experienced no thrill, and at these moments the idea had never occurred to him of planting a warm kiss on her lips as she struggled with a nervous laugh to free herself. The girl also seemed to have remained cold and indifferent. At times her great eyes rested on Camille and fixedly gazed at him with sovereign calm. On such occasions her lips alone made almost imperceptible little motions. Nothing could be read on her expressionless countenance, which an inexorable will always maintained gentle and attentive. Thérèse became grave when the conversation turned to her marriage, contenting herself with approving all that Madame Raquin said by a sign of the head. Camille went to sleep. On summer evenings the two young people ran to the edge of the water. Camille, irritated at the incessant attentions of his mother, at times broke out in an open revolt. He wished to run about and make himself ill, to escape the fondling that disgusted him. He would then drag Thérèse along with him, provoking her to wrestle, to roll in the grass. One day, having pushed his cousin down, the young girl bounded to her feet with all the savageness of a wild beast, and with flaming face and bloodshot eyes, fell upon him with clenched fists. Camille, in fear, sank to the ground. Months and years passed by, and at length the day fixed for the marriage arrived. Madame Raquin took Thérèse apart, spoke to her of her father and mother, and related to her the story of her birth. The young girl listened to her aunt, and when she had finished speaking, kissed her without answering a word. At night, Thérèse, instead of going into her own room, which was on the left of the staircase, entered that of her cousin, which was on the right. This was all the change that occurred in her mode of life. The following day, when the young couple came downstairs, Camille had still his sickly languidness, his righteous tranquillity of an egotist. Thérèse still maintained her gentle indifference and her restrained expression of frightful calmness. End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Wiesterli. Chapter 3. A week after the marriage, Camille distinctly told his mother that he intended quitting Vernon to reside in Paris. Madame Raquin protested. She had arranged her mode of life and would not modify it in any way. Thereupon her son had a nervous attack, and threatened to fall ill if she did not give way to his whim. "Never have I opposed you in your plans," said he. "I married my cousin. I took all the drugs you gave me. It is only natural now, when I have a desire of my own, that you should be of the same mind. We will move at the end of the month." Madame Raquin was unable to sleep all night. The decision Camille had come to upset her way of living, and, in despair, she sought to arrange another existence for herself and the married couple. Little by little she recovered calm. She reflected that the young people might have children, and that her small fortune would not then suffice. It was necessary to earn money, to go into business again, to find lucrative occupation for Thérèse. The next day she had become accustomed to the idea of moving, and had arranged a plan for a new life. At luncheon she was quite gay. "This is what we will do," said she to her children. "I will go to Paris to-morrow. There I will look out for a small mercery business for sale, and Thérèse and myself will resume selling needles and cotton, which will give us something to do. You, Camille, will act as you like. You can either stroll about in the sun, or you can find some employment." "I shall find employment," answered the young man. The truth was that an idiotic ambition had alone impelled Camille to leave Vernon. He wished to find a post in some important administration. He blushed with delight when he fancied he saw himself in the middle of a large office, with lustring elbow sleeves and a pen behind his ear. Thérèse was not consulted. She had always displayed such passive obedience that her aunt and husband no longer took the trouble to ask her opinion. She went where they went, she did what they did, without a complaint, without a reproach, without appearing even to be aware that she changed her place of residence. Madame Raquin came to Paris, and went straight to the Arcade of the Pont Neuf. An old maid at Vernon had sent her to one of her relatives, who in this arcade kept a mercery shop which she desired to get rid of. The former mercer found the shop rather small and rather dark, but in passing through Paris she had been taken aback by the noise in the street, by the luxuriously dressed windows, and this narrow gallery, this modest shop front, recalled her former place of business, which was so peaceful. She could fancy herself again in the provinces, and she drew a long breath, thinking that her dear children would be happy in this out-of-the-way corner. The low price asked for the business caused her to make up her mind. The owner sold it to her for 2,000 francs, and the rent of the shop on first floor was only 1,200 francs a year. Madame Raquin, who had close upon 4,000 francs saved up, calculated that she could pay for the business and settle the rent for the first year without encroaching on her fortune. The salary Camille would be receiving, and the profit on the mercery business would suffice, she thought, to meet the daily expenses, so that she need not touch the income of her funded money, which would capitalise and go towards providing marriage portions for her grandchildren. She returned to Vernon, beaming with pleasure, relating that she had found a gem, a delightful little place right in the centre of Paris. Little by little, at the end of a few days, in her conversations of an evening, the damp, obscure shop in the arcade became a palace. She pictured it to herself, so far as her memory served her, as convenient, spacious, tranquil, and replete with 1,000 inestimable advantages. "Ah, my dear Thérèse," said she, "you will see how happy we shall be in that nook. There are 3 beautiful rooms upstairs. The arcade is full of people. We will make charming displays. There is no fear of our feeling dull." But she did not stop there. All her instinct of a former shopkeeper was awakened. She gave advice to Thérèse beforehand as to buying and selling, and posted her up in all the tricks of small tradespeople. At length the family quitted the house behind the Seine, and on the evening of the same day were installed in the arcade of the Pont Neuf. When Thérèse entered the shop, where in future she was to live, it seemed to her that she was descending into the clammy soil of a grave. She felt quite disheartened and shivered with fear. She looked at the dirty, damp gallery, visited the shop, and ascending to the first floor, walked round each room. These bare apartments without furniture looked frightful in their solitude and dilapidation. The young woman could not make a gesture or utter a word. She was as if frozen. Her aunt and husband having come downstairs, she seated herself on a trunk, her hands rigid, her throat full of sobs, and yet she could not cry. Madame Raquin, face to face with reality, felt embarrassed and ashamed of her dreams. She sought to defend her acquisition. She found a remedy for every fresh inconvenience that was discovered, explaining the obscurity by saying the weather was overcast, and concluded by affirming that a sweep-up would suffice to set everything right. "Bah!" answered Camille. "All this is quite suitable. Besides, we shall only come up here at night. I shall not be home before 5 or 6 o'clock. As to you two, you will be together, so you will not be dull." The young man would never have consented to inhabit such a den, had he not relied on the comfort of his office. He said to himself that he would be warm all day at his administration, and that, at night, he would go to bed early. For a whole week the shop and lodging remained in disorder. Thérèse had seated herself behind the counter from the first day, and she did not move from that place. Madame Raquin was astonished at this depressed attitude. She had thought that the young woman would try to adorn her habitation, that she would place flowers at the windows, and ask for new papers, curtains, and carpets. When she suggested some repairs, some kind of embellishment, her niece quietly replied, "What need is there for it? We are very well as we are. There is no necessity for luxury." It was Madame Raquin who had to arrange the rooms and tidy up the shop. Thérèse at last lost patience at seeing the good old lady incessantly turning round and round before her eyes. She engaged a charwoman, and forced her aunt to be seated beside her. Camille remained a month without finding employment. He lived as little as possible in the shop, preferring to stroll about all day, and he found life so dreadfully dull with nothing to do, that he spoke of returning to Vernon. But he at length obtained a post in the administration of the Orleans Railway, where he earned 100 francs a month. His dream had become realised. He set out in the morning at 8 o'clock. Walking down the Rue Guénégaud, he found himself on the quays. Then, taking short steps with his hands in his pockets, he followed the Seine from the Institut to the Jardin des Plantes. This long journey, which he performed twice daily, never wearied him. He watched the water running along, and he stopped to see the rafts of wood descending the river pass by. He thought of nothing. Frequently he planted himself before Notre Dame, to contemplate the scaffolding surrounding the cathedral, which was then undergoing repair. These huge pieces of timber amused him, although he failed to understand why. Then he cast a glance into the Port au Vin as he went past, and after that counted the cabs coming from the station. In the evening, quite stupefied, with his head full of some silly story related to his office, he crossed the Jardin des Plantes, and went to have a look at the bears, if he was not in too great a hurry. There he remained half an hour, leaning over the rails at the top of the pit, observing the animals clumsily swaying to and fro. The behaviour of these huge beasts pleased him. He examined them with gaping mouth and rounded eyes, partaking of the joy of an idiot when he perceived them bestir themselves. At last he turned homewards, dragging his feet along, busying himself with the passers-by, with the vehicles, and the shops. As soon as he arrived he dined, and then began reading. He had purchased the works of Buffon, and every evening he set himself to peruse 20 to 30 pages, notwithstanding the wearisome nature of the task. He also read in serial, at 10 centimes the number, The History of the Consulate and Empire, by Thiers, and The History of the Girondins, by Lamartine, as well as some popular scientific works. He fancied he was labouring at his education. At times he forced his wife to listen to certain pages, to particular anecdotes, and felt very much astonished that Thérèse could remain pensive and silent the whole evening, without being tempted to take up a book. and he thought to himself that his wife must be a woman of very poor intelligence. Thérèse thrust books away from her with impatience. She preferred to remain idle, with her eyes fixed, and her thoughts wandering and lost. But she maintained an even, easy temper, exercising all her will to render herself a passive instrument, replete with supreme complaisance and abnegation. The shop did not do much business. The profit was the same regularly each month. The customers consisted of female workpeople living in the neighbourhood. Every 5 minutes a young girl came in to purchase a few sous worth of goods. Thérèse served the people with words that were ever the same, with a smile that appeared mechanically on her lips. Madame Raquin displayed a more unbending, a more gossipy disposition, and, to tell the truth, it was she who attracted and retained the customers. For 3 years, days followed days and resembled one another. Camille did not once absent himself from his office. His mother and wife hardly ever left the shop. Thérèse, residing in damp obscurity, in gloomy, crushing silence, saw life expand before her in all its nakedness, each night bringing the same cold couch, and each morn the same empty day. End of chapter 3. Recording by Kate Mackenzie.
Chapter 4 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 4. One day out of 7, on the Thursday evening, the Raquin family received their friends. They lit a large lamp in the dining room and put water on the fire to make tea. There was quite a set-out. This particular evening emerged in bold relief from the others. It had become one of the customs of the family, who regarded it in the light of a middle-class orgy full of giddy gaiety. They did not retire to rest until 11 o'clock at night. At Paris, Madame Raquin had found one of her old friends, the commissary of police Michaud, who had held a post at Vernon for 20 years, lodging in the same house as the mercer. A narrow intimacy had thus been established between them. Then, when the widow had sold her business to go and reside in the house beside the river, they had little by little lost sight of one another. Michaud left the provinces a few months later and came to live peacefully in Paris, Rue de Seine, on his pension of 1,500 francs. One rainy day he met his old friend in the arcade of the Pont Neuf, and the same evening dined with the family. The Thursday receptions began in this way. The former commissary of police got into the habit of calling on the Raquins regularly once a week. After a while he became accompanied by his son Olivier, a great fellow of 30, dry and thin, who had married a very little woman, slow and sickly. This Olivier held the post of head clerk in the section of order and security at the prefecture of police, worth 3,000 francs a year, which made Camille feel particularly jealous. From the first day he made his appearance, Thérèse detested this cold, rigid individual, who imagined he honoured the shop in the arcade by making a display of his great shrivelled up frame and the exhausted condition of his poor little wife. Camille introduced another guest, an old clerk from the Orleans Railway, named Grivet, who had been 20 years in the service of the company, where he now held the position of head clerk and earned 2,100 francs a year. It was he who gave out the work in the office where Camille had found employment, and the latter showed him certain respect. Camille, in his daydreams, had said to himself that Grivet would one day die, and then he would perhaps take his place at the end of a decade or so. Grivet was delighted at the welcome Madame Raquin gave him, and he returned every week with perfect regularity. 6 months later, his Thursday visit had become, in his way of thinking, a duty. He went to the arcade of the Pont Neuf just as he went every morning to his office, that is to say mechanically, and with the instinct of a brute. From this moment the gatherings became charming. At 7 o'clock Madame Raquin lit the fire, set the lamp in the centre of the table, placed a box of dominoes beside it, and wiped the tea service which was in the sideboard. Precisely at 8 o'clock old Michaud and Grivet met before the shop, one coming from the Rue de Seine, and the other from Rue Mazarine. As soon as they entered, all the family went up to the first door. There, in the dining room, they seated themselves round the table waiting for Olivier Michaud and his wife, who always arrived late. When the party was complete, Madame Raquin poured out the tea. Camille emptied the box of dominoes on the oilcloth table cover, and everyone became deeply interested in their hands. Henceforth nothing could be heard but the jingle of dominoes. At the end of each game the players quarrelled for 2 or 3 minutes, then mournful silence was resumed, broken by the sharp clanks of the dominoes. Thérèse played with an indifference that irritated Camille. She took François, the great tabby cat that Madame Raquin had brought from Vernon, on her lap, caressing it with one hand, whilst she placed her dominoes with the other. These Thursday evenings were a torture to her. Frequently she complained of being unwell, of a bad headache, so as not to play, and remained there doing nothing, and half asleep. An elbow on the table, her cheek resting on the palm of her hand, she watched the guests of her aunt and husband through a sort of yellow, smoky mist coming from the lamp. All these phases exasperated her. She looked from one to the other in profound disgust and secret irritation. Old Michaud exhibited a pasty countenance, spotted with red blotches, one of those death-like faces of an old man fallen into second childhood. Grivet had the narrow visage, the round eyes, the thin lips of an idiot. Olivier, whose bones were piercing his cheeks, gravely carried a stiff, insignificant head on a ridiculous body. As to Suzanne, the wife of Olivier, she was quite pale, with expressionless eyes, white lips, and a soft face. And Thérèse could not find one human being, not one living being among these grotesque and sinister creatures with whom she was shut up. Sometimes she had hallucinations. She imagined herself buried at the bottom of a tomb, in company with mechanical corpses, who, when the strings were pulled, moved their heads and agitated their legs and arms. The thick atmosphere of the dining room stifled her. The shivering silence, the yellow gleams of the lamps penetrated her with vague terror and inexpressible anguish. Below, to the door of the shop, they had fixed a bell whose sharp tinkle announced the entrance of customers. Thérèse had her ear on the alert, and when the bell rang she rapidly ran downstairs quite relieved, delighted at being able to quit the dining room. She slowly served the purchaser, and when she found herself alone she sat down behind the counter, where she remained as long as possible, dreading going upstairs again, and in the enjoyment of real pleasure at no longer having Grivet and Olivier before her eyes. The damp air of the shop calmed the burning fever of her hands, and she again fell into the customary grave reverie. But she could not remain like this for long. Camille became angry at her absence. He failed to comprehend how any one could prefer the shop to the dining room on a Thursday evening, and he leant over the banister to look for his wife. "What's the matter?" he would shout. "What are you doing there? Why don't you come up? Grivet has the devil's own luck. He has just won again." The young woman rose painfully, and ascending the dining room resumed her seat opposite old Michaud, whose pendant lips gave heart-rending smiles. And until 11 o'clock she remained oppressed in her chair, watching François, whom she held in her arms, so as to avoid seeing the cardboard dolls grimacing around her. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 5. On Thursday, Camille, on returning from his office, brought with him a great fellow with square shoulders, whom he pushed in a familiar manner into the shop. "Mother," he said to Madame Raquin, pointing to the newcomer, "do you recognize this gentleman?" The old mercer looked at the strapping blade, seeking among her recollections and finding nothing, while Thérèse placidly observed the scene. What? Resumed Camille. You don't recognize Laurent? Little Laurent, the son of Daddy Laurent, who owns those beautiful fields of corn out Juffor's way? Don't you remember? I went to school with him. He came to fetch me of a morning on leaving the house of his uncle, who was our neighbor, and you used to give him slices of bread and jam. All at once Madame Raquin recollected little Laurent, whom she found very much grown. It was quite 10 years since she had seen him. She now did her best to make him forget her lapse of memory in greeting him by recalling 1,000 little incidents of the past, and by adopting a wheedling manner towards him that was quite maternal. Laurent had seated himself. With a peaceful smile on his lips, he replied to the questions addressed to him in a clear voice, casting calm and easy glances around him. "Just imagine," said Camille, "this joker has been employed at the Orleans railway station for 18 months, and it was only to-night that we met and recognized one another. The administration is so vast, so important." As the young man made this remark, he opened his eyes wider and pinched his lips, proud to be a humble wheel in such a large machine. Shaking his head, he continued: "Oh, but he is in a good position. He has studied. He already earns 1,500 francs a year. His father sent him to college. He had read for the bar, and learnt painting. That is so, is it not, Laurent? You'll dine with us?" "I'm quite willing," boldly replied the other. He got rid of his hat and made himself comfortable in the shop, while Madame Raquin ran off to her stew pots. Thérèse, who had not yet pronounced a word, looked at the new arrival. She had never seen such a man before. Laurent, who was tall and robust, with a florid complexion, astonished her. It was with a feeling akin to admiration that she contemplated his low forehead planted with coarse black hair, his full cheeks, his red lips, his regular features of sanguineous beauty. For an instant her eyes rested on his neck, a neck that was thick and short, fat and powerful. Then she became lost in the contemplation of his great hands, which he kept spread out on his knees. The fingers were square, the clenched fist must be enormous, and would fell an ox. Laurent was a real son of a peasant, rather heavy in gait, with an arched back, with movements that were slow and precise, and an obstinate, tranquil manner. One felt that his apparel concealed round and well-developed muscles, and a body of thick, hard flesh. Thérèse examined him with curiosity, glancing from his fists to his face, and experienced little shivers when her eyes fell on his bull-like neck. Camille spread out his Buffon volumes and his serials at 10 centimes the number, to show his friend that he also studied. Then, as if answering an inquiry he had been making of himself for some minutes, he said to Laurent: "But surely you must know my wife. Don't you remember that little cousin who used to play with us at Vernon?" "I had no difficulty in recognizing Madame," answered Laurent, looking Thérèse full in the face. This penetrating glance troubled the young woman, who, nevertheless, gave a forced smile, and after exchanging a few words with Laurent and her husband, hurried away to join her aunt, feeling ill at ease. As soon as they had seated themselves at table and commenced the soup, Camille thought it right to be attentive to his friend. "How is your father?" he inquired. "Well, I don't know," answered Laurent. "We are not on good terms. We ceased corresponding 5 years ago." "Bah!" exclaimed the clerk, astonished at such a monstrosity. "Yes," continued the other, "the dear man has ideas of his own. As he is always at law with his neighbours, he sent me to college, in the fond hope that later on he would find in me an advocate who would win him all his actions. Oh, Daddy Laurent has naught but useful ambitions. He even wants to get something out of his follies." "And you wouldn't be an advocate?" inquired Camille, more and more astonished. "Faith, no," answered his friend with a smile. "For a couple of years I pretended to follow the classes, so as to draw the allowance of 1,200 francs which my father made me. I lived with one of my college chums, who is a painter, and I set about painting also. It amused me. The calling is droll, and not at all fatiguing. We smoked and joked all in the livelong day. The Raquin family opened their eyes in amazement. "Unfortunately," continued Laurent, "this could not last. My father found out that I was telling him falsehoods. He stopped my 100 francs a month, and invited me to return and plough the land with him. I then tried to paint pictures on religious subjects, which proved bad business. As I could plainly see that I was going to die of hunger, I sent art to the deuce and sought employment. My father will die one of these days, and I am waiting for that event to live and do nothing." Laurent spoke in a tranquil tone. In a few words he had just related a characteristic tale that depicted him at full length. In reality he was an idle fellow, with the appetite of a full-blooded man for everything, and very pronounced ideas as to easy and lasting employment. The only ambition of this great powerful frame was to do nothing, to grovel in idleness and satiation from hour to hour. He wanted to eat well, sleep well, to abundantly satisfy his passions, without moving from his place, without running the risk of the slightest fatigue. The profession of advocate had terrified him, and he shuddered at the idea of tilling the soil. He had plunged into art, hoping to find therein a calling suitable to an idle man. The paint-brush struck him as being an instrument light to handle, and he fancied success easy. His dream was a life of cheap sensuality, a beautiful existence full of houris, of repose on divans, of victuals and intoxication. The dream lasted so long as Daddy Laurent sent the crown pieces. But when the young man, who was already 30, perceived the wolf at the door, he began to reflect. Face to face with privations, he felt himself a coward. He would not have accepted a day without bread for the utmost glory art could bestow. As he had said himself, he sent art to the deuce as soon as he recognized that it would never suffice to satisfy his numerous requirements. His first efforts had been below mediocrity. His peasant eyes caught a clumsy, slovenly view of nature. His muddy, badly drawn, grimacing pictures defied all criticism. But he did not seem to have an overdose of vanity for an artist. He was not in dire despair when he had to put aside his brushes. All he really regretted was the vast studio of his college chum, where he had been voluptuously grovelling for 4 or 5 years. He also regretted the women who came to pose there. Nevertheless he found himself at ease in his position as clerk. He lived very well in a brutish fashion, and he was fond of his daily task, which did not fatigue him, and soothed his mind. Still one thing irritated him. The food at the 18 sous ordinaries failed to appease the gluttonous appetite of his stomach. As Camille listened to his friend, he contemplated him with all the astonishment of a simpleton. This feeble man was dreaming, in a childish manner, of this studio life which his friend had been alluding to, and he questioned Laurent on the subject. "So," said he, "there were lady models who posed before you in the nude?" "Oh, yes," answered Laurent with a smile, and looking at Thérèse, who had turned deadly pale. "You must have thought that very funny," continued Camille, laughing like a child. "It would have made me feel most awkward. I expect you were quite scandalized the first time it happened." Laurent had spread out one of his great hands, and was attentively looking at the palm. His fingers gave slight twitches, and his cheeks became flushed. "The first time," he answered, as if speaking to himself. "I fancy I thought it quite natural. This devilish art is exceedingly amusing, only it does not bring in a sou. I had a red-haired girl as model who was superb, firm white flesh, gorgeous bust, hips as wide as—" Laurent, raising his head, saw Thérèse mute and motionless opposite, gazing at him with ardent fixedness. Her dull black eyes seemed like two fathomless holes, and through her parted lips could be perceived the rosy tint of the inside of her mouth. She seemed as if overpowered by what she heard, and lost in thought. She continued listening. Laurent looked from Thérèse to Camille, and the former painter restrained a smile. He completed his phrase by a broad, voluptuous gesture, which the young woman followed with her eyes. They were at dessert, and Madame Raquin had just run downstairs to serve a customer. When the cloth was removed, Laurent, who for some minutes had been thoughtful, turned to Camille. "You know," he blurted out, "I must paint your portrait." This idea delighted Madame Raquin and her son, but Thérèse remained silent. "It is summer time," resumed Laurent, "and as we leave the office at 4 o'clock, I can come here and let you give me a sitting for a couple of hours in the evening. The picture will be finished in a week." "That will be fine," answered Camille, flushed with joy. "You shall dine with us. I will have my hair curled, and put on my black frock coat." 8 o'clock struck. Grivet and Michaud made their entry. Olivier and Suzanne arrived behind them. When Camille introduced his friend to the company, Grivet pinched his lips. He detested Laurent, whose salary, according to his idea, had risen far too rapidly. Besides, the introduction of a newcomer was quite an important matter, and the guests of the Raquins could not receive an individual unknown to them without some display of coldness. Laurent behaved very amicably. He grasped the situation, and did his best to please the company, so as to make himself acceptable to them at once. He related anecdotes, enlivened the party by his merry laughter, and even won the friendship of Grivet. That evening Thérèse made no attempt to go down to the shop. She remained seated on her chair until 11 o'clock, playing and talking, avoiding the eyes of Laurent, who for that matter did not trouble himself about her. The sanguineous temperament of this strapping fellow, his full voice and jovial laughter, troubled the young woman and threw her into a sort of nervous anguish. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 6. Henceforth, Laurent called almost every evening on the Raquins. He lived in the Rue Saint-Victor, opposite the Porte aux Vignes, where he rented a small furnished room at 18 francs a month. This attic, pierced at the top by a lift-up window, measured barely 9 square yards, and Laurent was in the habit of going home as late as possible at night. Previous to his meeting with Camille, the state of his purse not permitting him to idle away his time in the cafes, he loitered at the cheap eating-houses where he took his dinner, smoking his pipe and sipping his coffee and brandy, which cost him 3 sous. Then he slowly gained the Rue Saint-Victor, sauntering along the quays, where he seated himself on the benches in mild weather. The shop in the Arcade of the Pont Neuf became a charming retreat, warm and quiet, where he found amicable conversation and attention. He saved the 3 sous his coffee and brandy cost him, and gluttonously swallowed the excellent tea prepared by Madame Raquin. He remained there until 10 o'clock, dozing and digesting as if he were at home, and before taking his departure assisted Camille to put up the shutters and close the shop for the night. One evening he came with his easel and box of colours. He was to commence the portrait of Camille on the morrow. A canvas was purchased, minute preparations made, and the artist at last took the work in hand in the room occupied by the married couple, where Laurent said the light was the best. He took 3 evenings to draw the head. He carefully trailed the charcoal over the canvas with short, sorry strokes, his rigid, cold drawing recalling in a grotesque fashion that of the primitive masters. He copied the face of Camille with a hesitating hand, as a pupil copies an academical figure, with a clumsy exactitude that conveyed a scowl to the face. On the 4th day he placed tiny little dabs of colour on his palette, and commenced painting with the point of the brush. He then dotted the canvas with small dirty spots, and made short strokes altogether, as if he had been using a pencil. At the end of each sitting, Madame Raquin and Camille were in ecstasies. But Laurent said they must wait, that the resemblance would soon come. Since the portrait had been commenced, Thérèse no longer quitted the room, which had been transformed into a studio. Leaving her aunt alone behind the counter, she ran upstairs at the least pretext, and forgot herself watching Laurent paint. Still grave and oppressed, paler and more silent, she sat down and observed the labour of the brushes. But this sight did not seem to amuse her very much. She came to the spot as though attracted by some power, and she remained as if riveted there. Laurent at times turned round with a smile, inquiring whether the portrait pleased her. But she barely answered, a shiver ran through her frame, and she resumed her meditative trance. Laurent, returning at night to the Rue Saint-Victor, reasoned with himself at length, discussing in his mind whether he should become the lover of Thérèse or not. "Here is a little woman," said he to himself, "who will be my sweetheart whenever I choose. She is always there, behind my back, examining, measuring me, summing me up. She trembles. She has a strange face that is mute and yet impassioned. What a miserable creature that Camille is, to be sure!" And Laurent inwardly laughed as he thought of his pale, thin friend. Then he resumed. "She is bored to death in that shop. I go there because I have nowhere else to go to, otherwise they would not often catch me in the arcade of the Pont Neuf. It is damp and sad. A woman must be weary to death there. I please her, I am sure of it. Then why not me rather than another?" He stopped. Self-conceit was getting the better of him. Absorbed in thought, he watched the Seine running by. "Anyhow, come what may," he exclaimed, "I shall kiss her at the first opportunity. I bet she falls at once into my arms." As he resumed his walk, he was seized with indecision. "But she is ugly," thought he. "She has a long nose and a big mouth. Besides, I have not the least love for her. I shall perhaps get myself into trouble. The matter requires reflection." Laurent, who was very prudent, turned these thoughts over in his head for a whole week. He calculated all the possible inconveniences of an intrigue with Thérèse, and only decided to attempt the adventure when he felt convinced that it could be attended by no evil consequences. Thérèse would have every interest to conceal their intimacy, and he could get rid of her whenever he pleased. Even admitting that Camille discovered everything and got angry, he would knock him down if he became spiteful. From every point of view, that matter appeared to Laurent easy and engaging. Henceforth he enjoyed gentle quietude, waiting for the hour to strike. He had made up his mind to act boldly at the first opportunity. In the future he saw comfortable evenings, with all the Raquins contributing to his enjoyment. Thérèse giving him her love, Madame Raquin wheedling him like a mother, and Camille chatting with him so that he might not feel too dull at night in the shop. The portrait was almost completed, but the opportunity he desired did not occur. Thérèse, depressed and anxious, continued to remain in the room. But so did Camille, and Laurent was in despair at being unable to get rid of him. Nevertheless, the time came when he found himself obliged to mention that the portrait would be finished on the morrow, and Madame Raquin thereupon announced that they would celebrate the completion of the work of the artist by dining together. The next day, when Laurent had given the canvas the last touch, all the family assembled to go into raptures over the striking resemblance. The portrait was vile, a dirty grey colour with large violescent patches. Laurent could not use even the brightest colours without making them dull and muddy. In spite of himself, he had exaggerated the wan complexion of his model, and the countenance of Camille resembled the greenish visage of a person who had met death by drowning, the grimacing drawing through the features into convulsions, thus rendering the sinister resemblance all the more striking. But Camille was delighted. He declared that he had the appearance of a person of distinction on the canvas. When he had thoroughly admired his own face, he declared he would go and fetch a couple of bottles of champagne. Madame Raquin went down to the shop, and the artist was alone with Thérèse. The young woman had remained seated, gazing vaguely in front of her. Laurent hesitated. He examined the portrait, and played with his brushes. There was not much time to lose. Camille might come back, and the opportunity would perhaps not occur again. The painter abruptly turned round, and found himself face to face with Thérèse. They contemplated one another for a few seconds. Then, with a violent movement, Laurent bent down and pressed the young woman to him. Throwing back her head, he crushed her mouth beneath his lips. She made a savage, angry effort at revolt, and then all at once gave in. They exchanged not a word. The act was silent and brutal. End of chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bologna Times. Therese Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vistelli. Chapter 7. The two sweethearts from the commencement found their intrigue necessary, inevitable, and quite natural. At their first interview they conversed familiarly, kissing one another without embarrassment, and without a blush, as if their intimacy had dated back several years. They lived quite at ease in their new situation, with a tranquillity and an independence that were perfect. They made their appointments. Thérèse being unable to go out, it was arranged that Laurent should come to see her. In a clear, firm voice the young woman explained to him the plan she had conceived. The interview would take place in the nuptial chamber. The sweetheart would pass by the passage which ran into the arcade, and Thérèse would open the door on the staircase to him. During this time Camille would be at his office, and Madame Raquin below in the shop. This was a daring arrangement that ought to succeed. Laurent accepted. There was a sort of brutal temerity in his prudence, the temerity of a man with big fists. Choosing a pretext, he obtained permission from his chief to absent himself for a couple of hours, and hastened to the arcade of the Pont Neuf. The dealer in imitation jewelry was seated just opposite the door of the passage, and he had to wait until she was busy, until some young work girl came to purchase a ring or a brooch made of brass. Then, rapidly entering the passage, he ascended the narrow, dark staircase, leaning against the walls which were clammy with damp. He stumbled against the stone steps, and each time he did so he felt a red-hot iron piercing his chest. A door opened, and on the threshold, in the midst of a gleam of white light, he perceived Thérèse, who, closing the door after him, threw her arms about his neck. Laurent was astonished to find his sweetheart handsome. He had never seen her before as she appeared to him then. Thérèse, supple and strong, pressed him in her arms, flinging her head backward, while on her visage coursed ardent rays of light and passionate smiles. This face seemed as if transfigured, with its moist lips and sparkling eyes. It now had a fond, caressing look. It radiated. She was beautiful with the strong beauty born of passionate abandon. When Laurent parted from her, after his initial visit, he staggered like a drunken man, and the next day, on recovering his cunning, prudent calm, he asked himself whether he should return to this young woman whose kisses gave him the fever. First of all he positively decided to keep to himself. Then he had a cowardly feeling. He sought to forget, to avoid seeing Thérèse, and yet she always seemed to be there, implacably extending her arms. The physical suffering that this spectacle caused him became intolerable. He gave way. He arranged another meeting, and returned to the arcade of the Pont Neuf. From that day forth Thérèse entered into his life. He did not yet accept her, although he bore with her. He had his hours of terror, his moments of prudence, and altogether this intrigue caused him disagreeable agitation. But his discomfort and his fears disappeared. The meetings continued and multiplied. Thérèse experienced no hesitation. She went straight where her passion urged her to go. This woman, whose circumstances had bowed down, and who had at length drawn herself up erect, now revealed all her being and explained her life. "Oh, if you only knew," said she, "how I have suffered! I was brought up in the tepid, damp room of an invalid. I slept in the same bed as Camille. At night I got as far away from him as I could, to avoid the sickly odor of his body. He was naughty and obstinate. He would not take his physic unless I shared it with him. To please my aunt I was obliged to swallow a dose of every drug. I don't know how it is I have survived. They made me ugly. They robbed me of the only thing I possessed, and it is impossible for you to love me as I love you." She broke off and wept, and after kissing Laurent, continued with bitter hatred: "I do not wish them any harm. They brought me up, they received me and shielded me from misery. But I should have preferred abandonment to their hospitality. I had a burning desire for the open air. When quite young, my dream was to rove barefooted along the dusty roads, holding out my hand for charity, living like a gipsy. I have been told that my mother was a daughter of the chief of a tribe in Africa. I have often thought of her, and I understood that I belonged to her by blood and instinct. I should have liked to have never parted from her, and to have crossed the sand slung at her back. Ah, what a childhood! I still feel disgust and rebellion when I recall the long days I passed in the room where Camille was at death's door. I sat bent over the fire, stupidly watching the infusion simmer, and feeling my limbs growing stiff, and I could not move. My aunt scolded me if I made a noise. Later on I tasted profound joy in the little house beside the river, but I was already half feeble. I could barely walk, and when I tried to run I fell down. Then they buried me alive in this vile shop." After a pause, she resumed: "You will hardly credit how bad they have made me. They have turned me into a liar and a hypocrite. They have stifled me with their middle-class gentleness, and I can hardly understand how it is that there is still blood in my veins. I have lowered my eyes, and given myself a mournful, idiotic face like theirs. I have led their death-like life. When you saw me I looked like a blockhead, did I not? I was grave, overwhelmed, brutalized. I no longer had any hope. I thought of flinging myself into the Seine. But previous to this depression, what nights of anger I had! Down there at Vernon, in my frigid room, I bit my pillow to stifle my cries. I beat myself, taxed myself with cowardice. My blood was on the boil, and I would have lacerated my body. On 2 occasions I wanted to run away, to go straight before me, towards the sun. But my courage failed. They had turned me into a docile brute, with their tame benevolence and sickly tenderness. Then I lied. I always lied. I remained there quite gentle, quite silent, dreaming of striking and biting." After a silence, she continued: "I do not know why I consented to marry Camille. I did not protest, from a feeling of a sort of disdainful indifference. I pitied the child. When I played with him, I felt my fingers sink into the flesh of his limbs as into damp clay. I took him because my aunt offered him to me, and because I never intended to place any restraint on my actions on his account. I found my husband just the same little suffering boy whose bed I had shared when I was 6 years old. He was just as frail, just as plaintive, and he still had that insipid odor of a sick child that had been so repugnant to me previously. I am relating all this so that you may not be jealous. I was seized with a sort of disgust. I remember the physic I had drank. I got as far away from him as the bed would allow, and I passed terrible nights. But you, Thérèse drew herself up, bending backward, her fingers imprisoned in the massive hands of Laurent, gazing at his broad shoulders and enormous neck. I love you," she continued. "I loved you from the day Camille pushed you into the shop. You have perhaps no esteem for me, because I gave way at once. Truly, I know not how it happened. I am proud, I am passionate. I would have liked to have beaten you the first day when you kissed me. I do not know how it was I loved you. I hated you, rather. The sight of you irritated me and made me suffer. When you were there, my nerves were strained fit to snap. My head became quite empty. I was ready to commit a crime. Oh, how I suffered! And I sought this suffering. I waited for you to arrive. I loitered round your chair, so as to move in your breath, to drag my clothes over yours. It seemed as though your blood cast puffs of heat on me as I passed, and it was the sort of burning cloud in which you were enveloped that attracted me, and detained me beside you in spite of my secret revolt. You remember when you were painting here, a fatal power attracted me to your side, and I breathed your air with cruel delight. I know I seemed to be begging for kisses. I felt ashamed of my bondage. I felt I should fall if you were to touch me. But I gave way to my cowardice. I shivered with cold, waiting until you chose to take me in your arms. When Thérèse ceased speaking, she was quivering, as though proud at being avenged. In this bare and chilly room were enacted scenes of burning lust, sinister in their brutality. On her part, Thérèse seemed to revel in daring. The only precaution she would take when expecting her lover was to tell her aunt she was going upstairs to rest. But then, when he was there, she never bothered about avoiding noise, walking about and talking. At first this terrified Laurent. "For God's sake," he whispered, "don't make so much noise. Madame Raquin will hear." Thérèse would laugh. "Who cares? You are always so worried. She is at her counter and won't leave. She is too afraid of being robbed. Besides, you can hide." Laurent's passion had not yet stifled his native peasant caution, but soon he grew used to the risks of these meetings only a few yards from the old woman. One day, fearing her niece was ill, Madame Raquin climbed the stairs. Thérèse never bothered to bolt the bedroom door. At the sound of the woman's heavy step on the wooden stairs, Laurent became frantic. Thérèse laughed as she saw him searching for his waistcoat and hat. She grabbed his arm and pushed him down at the foot of the bed. With perfect self-possession she whispered, "Stay there. Don't move." She threw all his clothes that were lying about over him, and covered them with a white petticoat she had taken off. Without losing her calm, she lay down half naked, with her hair loose. When Madame Raquin quietly opened the door and tiptoed to the bed, the younger woman pretended to be asleep. Laurent, under all the clothes, was in a panic. "Thérèse," asked the old lady with some concern, "are you all right, my dear?" Thérèse, opening her eyes and yawning, answered that she had a terrible migraine. She begged her aunt to let her sleep some more. The old lady left the room as quietly as she had entered it. "So you see," Thérèse said triumphantly, "there is no reason to worry. These people are not in love. They are blind." At other times Thérèse seemed quite mad, wandering in her mind. She would see the cat, sitting motionless and dignified, looking at them. "Look at François," she said to Laurent. "You'd think he understands and is planning to tell Camille everything tonight. He knows a thing or two about us. Wouldn't it be funny if one day, in the shop, he just started talking?" The idea was delightful to Thérèse, but Laurent felt a shudder run through him as he looked at the cat's big green eyes. Thérèse's hold on him was not total, and he was scared. He got up and put the cat out of the room. End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 8. Laurent was perfectly happy of an evening in the shop. He generally returned from the office with Camille. Madame Raquin had formed quite a motherly affection for him. She knew he was short of cash, and indifferently nourished, that he slept in a garret. And she had told him, once for all, that a seat would always be kept for him at their table. She liked this young fellow with that expansive feeling that old women display for people who come from their own part of the country, bringing with them memories of the past. The young man took full advantage of this hospitality. Before going to dinner, after leaving the office for the night, he and Camille went for a stroll on the quays. Both found satisfaction in this intimacy. They dawdled along, chatting with one another, which prevented them feeling dull, and after a time decided to go and taste the soup prepared by Madame Raquin. Laurent opened the shop door as if he were master of the house, seated himself astride a chair, smoking and expectorating as though at home. The presence of Thérèse did not embarrass him in the least. He treated the young woman with friendly familiarity, paying her commonplace compliments, without a line of his face becoming disturbed. Camille laughed, and, as his wife confined herself to answering his friends in monosyllables, he firmly believed they detested one another. One day he even reproached Thérèse with what he termed her coldness for Laurent. Laurent had made a correct guess. He had become the sweetheart of the woman, the friend of the husband, the spoiled child of the mother. Never had he enjoyed such a capital time. His position in the family struck him as quite natural. He was on the most friendly terms with Camille, in regard to whom he felt neither anger nor remorse. He was so sure of being prudent and calm that he did not even keep watch on his gestures and speech. The egotism he displayed in the enjoyment of his good fortune shielded him from any fault. All that kept him from kissing Thérèse in the shop was the fear that he would not be allowed to come any more. He would not have cared a bit about hurting Camille and his mother. Thérèse, who was of a more nervous and quivering temperament, was compelled to play a part, and she played it to perfection, thanks to the clever hypocrisy she had acquired in her bringing up. For nearly 15 years she had been lying, stifling her fever, exerting an implacable will to appear gloomy and half asleep. It cost her nothing to keep this mask on her face, which gave her an appearance of icy frigidity. When Laurent entered the shop he found her glum, her nose longer, her lips thinner. She was ugly, cross, unapproachable. Nevertheless, she did not exaggerate her effects, but only played her former part, without awakening attention by greater harshness. She experienced extraordinary pleasure in deceiving Camille and Madame Raquin. She was aware she was doing wrong, and at times she felt a ferocious desire to rise from table and smother Laurent with kisses, just to show her husband and aunt that she was not a fool, and that she had a sweetheart. At moments she felt giddy with joy. Good actress as she proved herself, she could not on such occasions refrain from singing, when her sweetheart did not happen to be there, and she had no fear of betraying herself. These sudden outbursts of gaiety charmed Madame Raquin, who taxed her niece with being too serious. The young woman, moreover, decked the window of her room with pots of flowers, and then had new paper hung in the apartment. After this she wanted a carpet, curtains, and rosewood furniture. The nature of the circumstances seemed to have made this woman for this man, and to have thrust one towards the other. The two together, the woman nervous and hypocritical, the man sanguineous, and leading the life of a brute, formed a powerful couple allied. The one completed the other, and they mutually protected themselves. At night, at table, in the pale light of the lamp, one felt the strength of their union, at the sight of the heavy, smiling face of Laurent, opposite the mute, impenetrable mask of Thérèse. Those evenings were pleasant and calm. In the silence, in the transparent shadow and cool atmosphere, arose friendly conversation. The family and their guest sat close together round the table. After the dessert, they chatted about 1,000 trifles of the day, about incidents that had occurred the day before, about their hopes for the morrow. Camille liked Laurent as much as he was capable of liking anybody, after the fashion of a contented egotist, and Laurent seemed to show him equal attachment. Between them there was an exchange of kind sentences, of obliging gestures, and thoughtful attentions. Madame Raquin, with placid countenance, contributed her peacefulness to the tranquillity of the scene, which resembled a gathering of old friends who knew one another to the heart, and who confidently relied on the faith of their friendship. Thérèse, motionless, peaceful like the others, observed this joy, this smiling depression of these people of the middle class, and in her heart there was savage laughter. All her being jeered, but her face maintained its frigid rigidity. Ah, how she deceived these worthy people, and how delighted she was to deceive them with such triumphant impudence! Her sweetheart, at this moment, was like a person unknown to her, a comrade of her husband, a sort of simpleton, an interloper, concerning whom she had no need to concern herself. This atrocious comedy, these duperies of life, this comparison between the burning kisses in the daytime and the indifference played at night, gave new warmth to the blood of the young woman. When by chance Madame Raquin and Camille went downstairs, Thérèse bounded from her chair to silently, and with brutal energy, press her lips to those of her sweetheart, remaining thus breathless and choking until she heard the stairs creak. Then she briskly seated herself again, and resumed her glum grimace, while Laurent calmly continued the interrupted conversation with Camille. It was like a rapid, blinding flash of lightning in a leaden sky. On Thursday the evening became a little more animated. Laurent, although bored to death, nevertheless made a point of not missing one of these gatherings. As a measure of prudence, he desired to be known and esteemed by the friends of Camille. So he had to lend an ear to the idle talk of Grivet and old Michaud. The latter always related the same tales of robbery and murder, while Grivet spoke at the same time about his clerks, his chiefs, and his administration, until the young man sought refuge beside Olivier and Suzanne, whose stupidity seemed less wearisome. But he soon asked for the dominoes. It was on Thursday evening that Laurent and Thérèse arranged the day and hour of their meeting. In the bustle attending the departure, when Madame Raquin and Camille accompanied the guest to the door of the arcade, the young woman approached Laurent, to whom she spoke in an undertone, as she pressed his hand. At times, when all had turned their backs, she kissed him, out of a sort of bravado. The life of shocks and appeasements lasted 8 months. The sweethearts lived in complete beatitude. Thérèse no longer felt dull, and was perfectly contented. Laurent, satiated, pampered, fatter than before, had but one fear, that of seeing this delightful existence come to an end. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 9. One afternoon, as Laurent was leaving his office to run and meet Thérèse, who was expecting him, his chief gave him to understand that in future he was forbidden to absent himself. He had taken too many holidays already, and the authorities had decided to dismiss him if he again went out in office hours. Riveted to his chair, he remained in despair until eventide. He had to earn his living, and dared not lose his place. At night the wrathful countenance of Thérèse was a torture to him, and he was unable to find an opportunity to explain to her how it was he had broken his word. At length, as Camille was putting up the shutters, he briskly approached the young woman, to murmur in an undertone, "We shall be unable to see one another any more. My chief refuses to give me permission to go out." Camille came into the shop, and Laurent was obliged to withdraw without giving any further information, leaving Thérèse under the disagreeable influence of this abrupt and unpleasant announcement. Exasperated at anyone daring to interfere with her delectation, she passed a sleepless night, arranging extravagant plans for a meeting with her sweetheart. The following Thursday she spoke with Laurent for a minute at the most. Their anxiety was all the keener as they did not know where to meet for the purpose of consulting and coming to an understanding. The young woman, on this occasion, gave her sweetheart another appointment, which for the second time he failed to keep, and she then had but one fixed idea, to see him at any cost. For a fortnight Laurent was unable to speak to Thérèse alone, and he then felt how necessary this woman had become to his existence. Far from experiencing any uneasiness, as formerly, at the kisses which his lady-love showered on him, he now sought her embraces with the obstinacy of a famished animal. A sanguineous passion had lurked in his muscles, and now that his sweetheart was taken from him, this passion burst out in blind violence. He was madly in love. This thriving brutish nature seemed unconscious in everything. He obeyed his instincts, permitting the will of his organism to lead him. A year before he would have burst into laughter had he been told he would become the slave of a woman, to the point of risking his tranquillity. The hidden forces of lust that had brought about this result had been secretly proceeding within him, to end by casting him, bound hand and foot, into the arms of Thérèse. At this hour he was in dread lest he should omit to be prudent. He no longer dared go of an evening to the shop in the arcade of the Pont Neuf, lest he should commit some folly. He no longer belonged to himself. His lady-love, with her feline suppleness, her nervous flexibility, had glided, little by little, into each fibre of his body. This woman was as necessary to his life as eating and drinking. He would certainly have committed some folly had he not received a letter from Thérèse asking him to remain at home the following evening. His sweetheart promised him to call about 8 o'clock. On quitting the office, he got rid of Camille by saying he was tired, and should go to bed at once. Thérèse, after dinner, also played her part. She mentioned a customer who had moved without paying her, and acting the indignant creditor who would listen to nothing, declared that she intended calling on her debtor with the view of asking for payment of the money that was due. The customer now lived at Batignolles. Madame Raquin and Camille considered this a long way to go, and thought it doubtful whether the journey would have a satisfactory result. But they expressed no surprise, and allowed Thérèse to set out on her errand in all tranquillity. The young woman ran to the Porte aux Vins, gliding over the slippery pavement, and knocking up against the passers-by in her hurry to reach her destination. Beads of perspiration covered her face, and her hands were burning. Any one might have taken her for a drunken woman. She rapidly ascended the staircase of the hotel, and on reaching the 6th floor, out of breath, and with wandering eyes, she perceived Laurent, who was leaning over the banister, awaiting her. She entered the garret, which was so small that she could barely turn round in it, and tearing off her hat with one hand, leant against the bedstead in a faint. Through the lift-up window in the roof, which was wide open, the freshness of the evening fell upon the burning couch. The couple remained some time in this wretched little room, as though at the bottom of a hole. All at once Thérèse heard a clock in the neighbourhood strike 10. She felt as if she would have liked to have been deaf. Nevertheless, she looked for her hat, which she fastened to her hair with a long pin, and then, seating herself, slowly murmured, "I must go." Laurent fell on his knees before her, and took her hands. "Good-bye, till we see each other again," said she, without moving. "No, not until we see each other again," he exclaimed. "That is too indefinite. When will you come again?" She looked him full in the face. "Do you wish me to be frank with you?" she inquired. "Well, then, to tell you the truth, I think I shall come no more. I have no pretext, and I cannot invent one." "Then we must say farewell," he remarked. "No, I will not do that," she answered. She pronounced these words in terrified anger. Then she added more gently, without knowing what she was saying, and without moving from her chair, "I am going." Laurent reflected. He was thinking of Camille. "I wish him no harm," said he, at length, without pronouncing the name. "But really he is too much in our way. Couldn't you get rid of him? Send him on a journey somewhere, a long way off?" "Ah, yes, send him on a journey," resumed the young woman, nodding her head. "And do you imagine a man like that would consent to travel? There is only one journey, that from which you never return. But he will bury us all. People who are at their last breath never die." Then came a silence which was broken by Laurent, who remarked: "I had a daydream. Camille met with an accident and died, and I became your husband. Do you understand?" "Yes, yes," answered Thérèse, shuddering. Then, abruptly bending over the face of Laurent, she smothered it with kisses, and bursting into sobs, uttered these disjoined sentences amidst her tears: "Don't talk like that, for if you do, I shall lack the strength to leave you. I shall remain here. Give me courage rather. Tell me we shall see one another again. You have need of me, have you not? Well, one of these days we shall find a way to live together." "Then come back tomorrow," said Laurent. "But I cannot return," she answered. "I have told you, I have no pretext." She wrung her hands and continued: "Oh, I do not fear the scandal. If you like, when I get back I will tell Camille you are my sweetheart, and return here. I am trembling for you. I do not wish to disturb your life. I want to make you happy." The prudent instincts of the young man were awakened. "You are right," said he. "We must not behave like children. Ah, if your husband were to die!" "If my husband were to die," slowly repeated Thérèse. "We would marry," he continued, "and have nothing more to fear. What a nice, gentle life it would be!" The young woman stood up erect. Her cheeks were pale, and she looked at her sweetheart with a clouded brow, while her lips were twitching. "Sometimes people die," she murmured at last. "Only it is dangerous for those who survive." Laurent did not reply. "You see," she continued, "all the methods that are known are bad." "You misunderstood me," said he, quietly. "I am not a fool. I wish to love you in peace. I was thinking that accidents happen daily, that a foot may slip, a tile may fall. You understand? In the latter event, the wind alone is guilty." He spoke in a strange voice, then he smiled, and added in a caressing tone: "Never mind, keep quiet. We will love one another fondly, and live happily. As you are unable to come here, I will arrange matters. Should we remain a few months without seeing one another, do not forget me, and bear in mind that I am laboring for your felicity." As Thérèse opened the door to leave, he seized her in his arms. "You are mine, are you not?" he continued. "You swear to belong to me at any hour when I choose." "Yes," exclaimed the young woman, "I am yours. Do as you please with me." For a moment they remained locked together and mute. Then Thérèse tore herself roughly away, and, without turning her head, quitted the garret and went downstairs. Laurent listened to the sound of her footsteps fading away. When he heard the last of them, he returned to his wretched room, and went to bed. The sheets were still warm. Without closing the window, he lay on his back, his arms bare, his hands open, exposed to the fresh air. And he reflected, with his eyes on the dark blue square that the window framed in the sky. He turned the same idea over in his head until daybreak. Previous to the visit of Thérèse, The idea of murdering Camille had not occurred to him. He had spoken of the death of this man, urged to do so by the facts, irritated at the thought that he would be unable to meet his sweetheart any more, and it was thus that a new corner of his unconscious nature came to be revealed. Now that he was more calm, alone in the middle of the peaceful night, he studied the murder. The idea of death, blurted out in despair between a couple of kisses, returned implacable and keen. Racked by insomnia, and unnerved by the visit of Thérèse, he calculated the disadvantages and the advantages of his becoming an assassin. All his interests urged him to commit the crime. He said to himself that as his father, the Juffos peasant, could not make up his mind to die, he would perhaps have to remain a clerk another 10 years, eating in cheap restaurants and living in a garret. This idea exasperated him. On the other hand, if Camille were dead, he would marry Thérèse, he would inherit from Madame Raquin, resign his clerkship, and saunter about in the sun. Then he took pleasure in dreaming of his life of idleness. He saw himself with nothing to do, eating and sleeping, patiently awaiting the death of his father. And when the reality arose in the middle of his dream, he ran up against Camille and clenched his fists to knock him down. Laurent desired Thérèse. He wanted her for himself alone, to have her always within reach. If he failed to make the husband disappear, the woman would escape him. She had said so, she could not return. He would have eloped with her, carried her off somewhere, but then both would die of hunger. He risked less in killing the husband. There would be no scandal. He would simply push a man away to take his place. In his brutal logic of a peasant, he found this method excellent and natural. His innate prudence even advised this rapid expedient. He grovelled on his bed in perspiration, flat on his stomach, with his face against the pillow, and he remained there breathless, stifling, seeing lines of fire pass along his closed eyelids. He asked himself how he would kill Camille. Then, unable to breathe any more, he turned round at a bound to resume his position on his back, and with his eyes wide open, received full in the face the puffs of cold air from the window, seeking in the stars, in the bluish square of sky, a piece of advice about murder, a plan of assassination. And he found nothing. As he had told his lady love, he was neither a child nor a fool. He wanted neither a dagger nor poison. What he sought was a subtle crime, one that could be accomplished without danger, a sort of sinister suffocation, without cries and without terror, a simple disappearance. Passion might well stir him and urge him forward. All his being imperiously insisted on prudence. He was too cowardly, too voluptuous to risk his tranquillity. If he killed, it would be for a calm and happy life. Little by little slumber overcame him. Fatigued and appeased, he sank into a sort of gentle and uncertain torpor. As he fell asleep, he decided he would await a favourable opportunity, and his thoughts, fleeting further and further away, lulled him to rest with the murmur, "I will kill him, I will kill him." 5 minutes later he was at rest, breathing with serene regularity. Thérèse returned home at 11 o'clock with a burning head and her thoughts strained, reaching the arcade of the Pont Neuf unconscious of the road she had taken. It seemed to her that she had just come downstairs from her visit to Laurent, so full were her ears of the words she had recently heard. She found Madame Raquin and Camille anxious and attentive, but she answered their questions sharply, saying she had been on a fool's errand and had waited an hour on the pavement for an omnibus. When she got into bed she found the sheets cold and damp. Her limbs, which were still burning, shuddered with repugnance. Camille soon fell asleep, and for a long time Thérèse watched his wan face reposing idiotically on the pillow, with his mouth wide open. Thérèse drew away from her husband. She felt a desire to drive her clenched fist into that mouth. Chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 10. More than 3 weeks passed. Laurent came to the shop every evening, looking weary and unwell. A light bluish circle surrounded his eyes, and his lips were becoming pale and chapped. Otherwise he still maintained his obtuse tranquillity. He looked Camille in the face, and showed him the same frank friendship. Madame Raquin pampered the friend of the family the more, now that she saw him giving way to a sort of low fever. Thérèse had resumed her mute, glum countenance and manner. She was more motionless, more impenetrable, more peaceful than ever. She did not seem to trouble herself in the least about Laurent. She barely looked at him, rarely exchanged a word with him, treating him with perfect indifference. Madame Raquin, who in her goodness of heart felt pained at his attitude, sometimes said to the young man, "Do not pay attention to the manner of my niece. I know her. Her face appears cold, but her heart is warm with tenderness and devotedness." The two sweethearts had no more meetings. Since the evening in the Rue Saint-Victor they had not met alone. At night, when they found themselves face to face, placid in appearance and like strangers to one another, storms of passion and dismay passed beneath the calm flesh of their countenance. And while with Thérèse there were outbursts of fury, base ideas and cruel jeers, with Laurent there were sombre brutalities and poignant indecisions. Neither dared search to the bottom of their beings, to the bottom of that cloudy fever that filled their brains with a sort of thick and acrid vapor. When they could press the hands of one another behind a door without speaking, they did so, fit to crush them in a short, rough clasp. They would have liked, mutually, to have carried off strips of their flesh clinging to their fingers. They had not but this pressure of hands to appease their feelings. They put all their souls into them, and asked for nothing more from one another. They waited. One Thursday evening, before sitting down to the game of dominoes, the guests of the Raquin family had a chat, as usual. A favorite subject of conversation was afforded by the experiences of old Michaud, who was plied with questions respecting the strange and sinister adventures with which he must have been connected in the discharge of his former functions. Then Grivet and Camille listened to the stories of the commissary, with the affrighted and gaping countenances of small children listening to Blue Beard or Tom Thumb. These tales terrified and amused them. On this particular Thursday, Michaud, who had just given an account of a horrible murder, the details of which had made his audience shudder, added as he wagged his head, "And a great deal never comes out at all. How many crimes remain undiscovered, how many murderers escape the justice of man." "What!" exclaimed Grivet, astonished. "You think there are foul creatures like that walking about the streets, people who have murdered and are not arrested?" Olivier smiled with an air of disdain. "My dear sir," he answered in his dictatorial tone, "if they are not arrested it is because no one is aware that they have committed a murder." This reasoning did not appear to convince Grivet, and Camille came to his assistance. "I am of the opinion of Monsieur Grivet," said he, with silly importance. "I should like to believe that the police do their duty, and that I never brush against a murderer on the pavement." Olivier considered this remark a personal attack. "Certainly the police do their duty," he exclaimed in a vexed tone. "Still we cannot do what is impossible. There are wretches who have studied crime at Satan's own school. They would escape the divinity himself. Isn't that so, father?" "Yes, yes," confirmed old Michaud. "Thus, while I was at Vernon, you perhaps remember the incident, Madame Raquin, a wagoner was murdered on the highway. The corpse was found cut in pieces at the bottom of a ditch. The authorities were never able to lay hands on the culprit. He is perhaps still living at this hour. Maybe he is our neighbor, and perhaps Monsieur Grivet will meet him on his way home." Grivet turned pale as a sheet. He dared not look around. He fancied the murderer of the wagoner was behind him, but for that matter he was delighted to feel afraid. "Well, no," he faltered, hardly knowing what he said. "Well, no, I cannot believe that. But I also have a story. Once upon a time a servant was put in prison for stealing a silver spoon and fork belonging to her master and mistress. 2 months afterwards, while a tree was being felled, the knife and fork were discovered in the nest of a magpie. It was the magpie who was the thief. The servant was released. You see that the guilty are always punished." Grivet triumphed. Olivier sneered. "Then they put the magpie in prison," said he. "That is not what Monsieur Grivet meant to say," answered Camille, annoyed to see his chief turned into ridicule. "Mother, give us the dominoes." While Madame Raquin went to fetch the box, the young man, addressing Michaud, continued: "Then you admit the police are powerless, that there are murderers walking about in the sunshine?" "Unfortunately, yes," answered the commissary. "It is immoral," concluded Grivet. During this conversation, Thérèse and Laurent had remained silent. They had not even smiled at the folly of Grivet. Both leaning with their arms on the table, looking slightly pale, and with a vague expression in their eyes, listened. At one moment those dark, ardent orbs had met, and small drops of perspiration pearled at the roots of the hair of Thérèse, while chilly puffs of breath gave imperceptible shivers to the skin of Laurent. Chapter 10.
Chapter 11 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Stevenson. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernst Alfred Viztelly. Chapter 11. Sometimes on a Sunday, when the weather was fine, Camille forced Thérèse to go out with him for a walk in the Champs-Élysées. The young woman would have preferred to remain in the damp obscurity of the arcade, for the exercise fatigued her, and it worried her to be on the arm of her husband, who dragged her along the pavement, stopping before the shop windows, expressing his astonishment, making reflections, and then falling into ridiculous spells of silence. But Camille insisted on these Sunday outings, which gave him the satisfaction of showing off his wife. When he met a colleague, particularly one of his chiefs, he felt quite proud to exchange bows with him in the company of Madame. Besides, he walked for the sake of walking, and he did so almost in silence, stiff and deformed in his Sunday clothes, dragging along his feet, and looking silly and vain. It made Thérèse suffer to be seen arm in arm with such a man. On these walking out days, Madame Raquin accompanied her children to the end of the arcade, where she embraced them as if they were leaving on a journey, giving them endless advice accompanied by fervent prayers. "Particularly beware of accidents," she would say. "There are so many vehicles in the streets of Paris. Promise me not to get into a crowd." At last she allowed them to set out, but she followed them a considerable distance with her eyes before returning to the shop. Her lower limbs were becoming unwieldy, which prohibited her taking long walks. On other occasions, but more rarely, the married couple went out of Paris, as far as Saint-Ouen or Asnières, where they treated themselves to a dish of fried fish in one of the restaurants beside the river. These were regarded as days of great revelry, which were spoken of a month beforehand. Thérèse engaged more willingly, almost with joy, in these excursions, which kept her in the open air until 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Saint-Ouen, with its green isles, reminded her of Vernon, and rekindled all the wild love she had felt for the Seine when a little girl. She seated herself on the gravel, dipped her hands in the water, feeling full of life in the burning heat of the sun, attenuated by the fresh puffs of breeze in the shade. While she tore and soiled her frock on the stones and clammy ground, Camille neatly spread out his pocket handkerchief and sank down beside her with endless precautions. Latterly, the young couple almost invariably took Laurent with them. He enlivened the excursion by his laughter and strength of a peasant. One Sunday, Camille, Thérèse and Laurent left for the Saint-Ouen after breakfast at about 11 o'clock. The outing had been projected a long time, and was to be the last of the season. Autumn approached, and the cold breezes at night began to make the air chilly. On this particular morning, the sky maintained all its blue serenity. It proved warm in the sun and tepid in the shade. The party decided they must take advantage of the last fine weather. Hailing a passing cab, they set out, accompanied by the pitiful expressions of uneasiness and the anxious effusions of the old mercer. Crossing Paris, they left the vehicle at the fortifications and gained Saint-Ouen on foot. It was noon. The dusty road, brightly lit up by the sun, had the blinding whiteness of snow. The air was intensely warm, heavy and pungent. Thérèse, on the arm of Camille, walked with short steps, concealing herself beneath her umbrella, while her husband fanned his face with an immense handkerchief. Behind them came Laurent, who had the sun streaming fiercely on the back of his neck, without appearing to notice it. He whistled and kicked the stones before him as he strolled along. Now and again there was a fierce glint in his eyes as he watched Thérèse's swinging hips. On reaching Saint-Ouen, they lost no time looking for a cluster of trees, a patch of green grass in the shade. Crossing the water to an island, they plunged into a bit of underwood. The fallen leaves covered the ground with a russety bed, which cracked beneath their feet with sharp, quivering sounds. Innumerable trunks of trees rose up erect, like clusters of small Gothic columns. The branches descended on the foreheads of the three holiday-makers, whose only view was the expiring copper-like foliage and the black and white stems of the aspens and oaks. They were in the wilderness, in a melancholy corner, in a narrow clearing that was silent and fresh. All around them they heard the murmur of the Seine. Camille, having selected a dry spot, seated himself on the ground, after lifting up the skirt of his frock-coat, while Thérèse, amid a loud crumpling of petticoats, had just flung herself among the leaves. Laurent lay on his stomach, with his chin resting on the ground. They remained 3 hours in this clearing, waiting till it became cooler, to take a run in the country before dinner. Camille talked about his office, and related silly stories. Then, feeling fatigued, he let himself fall backwards and went to sleep with the rim of his hat over his eyes. Thérèse had closed her eyelids some time previously, feigning slumber. Laurent, who felt wide awake and was tired of his recumbent position, crept up behind her and kissed her shoe and ankle. For a month his life had been chaste, and this walk in the sun had set him on fire. Here he was, in a hidden retreat, and unable to hold to his breast the woman who was really his. Her husband might wake up, and all his prudent calculations would be ruined by this obstacle of a man. So he lay flat on the ground, hidden by his lover's skirts, trembling with exasperation as he pressed kiss after kiss upon his shoe and white stocking. Thérèse made no movement. Laurent thought she was asleep. He rose to his feet and stood with his back to a tree. Then he perceived that the young woman was gazing into space with her great, sparkling eyes wide open. Her face, laying between her arms, with her hands clasped above her head, was deadly pale, and wore an expression of frigid rigidity. Thérèse was musing. Her fixed eyes resembled dark, unfathomable depths, where naught was visible save night. She did not move. She did not cast a glance at Laurent, who stood erect behind her. Her sweetheart contemplated her, and was almost affrighted to see her so motionless and mute. He would have liked to have bent forward and closed those great open eyes with a kiss. But Camille lay asleep close at hand. This poor creature, with his body twisted out of shape, displaying his lean proportions, was gently snoring. Under the hat, half concealing his face, could be seen his mouth contorted into a silly grimace in his slumber. A few short reddish hairs on a bony chin sullied his livid skin, and his head being thrown backwards, his thin wrinkled neck appeared, with Adam's apple standing out prominently in brick red in the centre and rising at each snore. Camille, spread out on the ground in this fashion, looked contemptible and vile. Laurent, who looked at him, abruptly raised his heel. He was going to crush his face with one blow. Thérèse restrained a cry. She went a shade paler than before, closed her eyes, and turned her head away as if to avoid being bespattered with blood. Laurent, for a few seconds, remained with his heel in the air above the face of the slumbering Camille. Then slowly, straightening his leg, he moved a few paces away. He reflected that this would be a form of murder which such as an idiot would choose. This pounded head would have settled the police on him. If he wanted to get rid of Camille, it was solely for the purpose of marrying Thérèse. It was his intention to bask in the sun after the crime, like the murder of the wagoner in the story related by old Michaud. He went as far as the edge of the water and watched the running river in a stupid manner. Then he abruptly turned into the underwood again. He had just arranged a plan. He had thought of a mode of murder that would be convenient and without danger to himself. He awoke the sleeper by tickling his nose with a straw. Camille sneezed, got up, and pronounced the joke a capital one. He liked Laurent on account of his tomfoolery, which made him laugh. He now roused his wife, who kept her eyes closed. When she had risen to her feet and shaken her skirt, which was all crumpled and covered with dry leaves, the party quitted the clearing, breaking the small branches they found in their way. They left the island and walked along the road, along the byways crowded with groups in Sunday finery. Between the hedges ran girls in light frocks. A number of boating men passed by singing. Files of middle-class couples, of elderly persons, of clerks and shopmen with their wives, walked with short steps beside the ditches. Each road seemed like a populous, noisy street. The sun alone maintained its great tranquillity. It was descending towards the horizon, casting on the reddened trees and white thoroughfares immense sheets of pale light. Penetrating freshness began to fall from the quivering sky. Camille had ceased giving his arm to Thérèse. He was chatting with Laurent, laughing at his jests, at the feats of strength of his friend, who leapt the ditches and raised huge stones above his head. The young woman on the other side of the road advanced with her head bent forward, stooping down from time to time to gather a herb. When she had fallen behind, she stopped and observed her sweetheart and her husband in the distance. "Hey! Aren't you hungry?" shouted Camille at her. "Yes," she replied. "Then come on," said he. Thérèse was not hungry, but felt tired and uneasy. She was in ignorance of the designs of Laurent, and her lower limbs were trembling with anxiety. The three, returning to the riverside, found a restaurant, where they seated themselves at a table on a sort of terrace formed of planks, in an indifferent eating-house, reeking with the odour of grease and wine. This place resounded with cries, songs, and the clatter of plates and dishes. In each private room and public saloon were parties talking in loud voices, and the thin partitions gave vibrating sonority to all this riot. The waiters, ascending to the upper rooms, caused the staircase to shake. Above, on the terrace, the puffs of air from the river drove away the smell of fat. Thérèse, leaning over the balustrade, observed the quay. To right and left, extended 2 lines of wine shops and shanties of showmen. Beneath the arbours in the gardens of the former, amid the few remaining yellow leaves, one perceived the white tablecloths, the dabs of black formed by men's coats, and the brilliant skirts of women. People passed to and fro, bareheaded, running and laughing. With the boiling noise of the crowd was mingled the lamentable strains of the barrel organs. An odour of dust and frying food hung in the calm air. Below Thérèse, some tarts from the Latin Quarter were dancing in a ring on a patch of worn turf, singing an infantile rondelay. With hats fallen on their shoulders and hair unbound, they held one another by the hands, playing like little children. They still managed to find a small thread of fresh voice, and their pale countenances, ruffled by brutal caresses, became tenderly coloured with virgin-like blushes, while their great impure eyes filled with moisture. A few students smoking clean clay pipes, who were watching them as they turned round, greeted them with ribald jests. And beyond, on the Seine, on the hillocks, descended the serenity of night, a sort of vague bluish mist, which bathed the trees in transparent vapour. "Hey, waiter!" shouted Laurent, leaning over the banister. "What about this dinner?" Then, changing his mind, he turned to Camille and said, "I say, Camille, let us go for a pull on the river before sitting down to table. It will give them time to roast the fowl. We shall be bored to death waiting an hour here." "As you like," answered Camille carelessly. "But Thérèse is hungry." "No, no, I can wait," hastened to say the young woman, at whom Laurent was fixedly looking. All three went downstairs again. Passing before the rostrum, where the lady cashier was seated, they retained a table and decided on a menu, saying they would return in an hour. As the host let out pleasure boats, they asked him to come and detach one. Laurent selected a skiff, which appeared so light that Camille was terrified by its fragility. "The deuce," he said, "we shall have to be careful not to move about in this, otherwise we shall get a famous ducking." The truth was that the clerk had a horrible dread of the water. At Vernon his sickly condition did not permit him when a child to go and dabble in the Seine. Whilst his schoolfellows ran and threw themselves into the river, he lay abed between a couple of warm blankets. Laurent had become an intrepid swimmer and an indefatigable oarsman. Camille had preserved that terror for deep water which is inherent in women and children. He tapped the end of the boat with his foot to make sure of its solidity. "Come on, get in!" cried Laurent with a laugh. "You're always trembling." Camille stepped over the side and went staggering to seat himself at the stern. When he felt the planks under him, he was at ease, and joked to show his courage. Thérèse had remained on the bank, standing grave and motionless beside her sweetheart, who held the rope. He bent down and rapidly murmured in an undertone, "Be careful. I'm going to pitch him in the river. Obey me. I answer for everything." The young woman turned horribly pale. She remained as if riveted to the ground. She was rigid, and her eyes had opened wider. "Get into the boat," Laurent murmured again. She did not move. A terrible struggle was passing within her. She strained her will with all her might to avoid bursting into sobs and falling to the ground. "Ah, ah!" cried Camille. "Laurent, just look at Thérèse. It's she who's afraid. She'll get in." "No, she won't get in." He had now spread himself out on the back seat, his 2 arms on the side of the boat, and was showing off with fanfaronade. The chuckles of this poor man were like cuts from a whip to Thérèse, lashing and urging her on. She abruptly sprang into the boat, remaining in the bows. Laurent grasped the sculls. The skiff left the bank, advancing slowly towards the isles. Twilight came. Huge shadows fell from the trees, and the water ran black at the edges. In the middle of the river were great pale silver trails. The boat was soon in full steam. There all the sounds of the quays softened. The singing and the cries came vague and melancholy with sad languidness. The odour of frying and dust had passed away. The air was freshened. It turned cold. Laurent, resting on his sculls, allowed the boat to drift along in the current. Opposite rose the great reddish mass of trees on the islands. The two sombre brown banks, patched with grey, were like a couple of broad bands stretching towards the horizon. The water and sky seemed as if cut from the same whitish piece of material. Nothing looks more painfully calm than an autumn twilight. The sun rays pale in the quivering air. The old trees cast their leaves. The country, scorched by the ardent beams of summer, feels death coming with the first cold winds. And in the sky there are plaintive sighs of despair. Night falls from above, bringing winding sheets in its shade. The party was silent. Seated at the bottom of the boat, drifting with the stream, they watched the final gleams of light quitting the tall branches. They approached the islands. The great rusty masses grew sombre. All the landscape seemed simplified in the twilight. The Seine, the sky, the islands, the slopes were naught but brown and grey patches, which faded away amidst milky fog. Camille, who had ended by lying down on his stomach with his head over the water, dipped his hand in the river. "The deuce, how cold it is!" he exclaimed. "It would not be pleasant to go in there head foremost." Laurent did not answer. For an instant he had been observing the two banks of the river with uneasiness. He advanced his huge hands to his knees, tightly compressing his lips. Thérèse, rigid and motionless, with her head thrown slightly backwards, waited. The skiff was about to enter a small arm of the river that was sombre and narrow, penetrating between two islands. Behind one of these islands could be distinguished the softened melody of a boating party, who seemed to be ascending the Seine. Up the river in the distance the water was free. Then Laurent rose and clasped Camille round the body. The clerk burst into laughter. "Ah, no, you tickle me," he said. "None of these jokes. Look here, stop! You'll make me fall over." Laurent grasped him tighter and gave a jerk. Camille, turning round, perceived the terrifying face of his friend, violently agitated. He failed to understand. He was seized by vague terror. He wanted to shout, and felt a rough hand seize him by the throat. With the instinct of an animal on the defensive, he rose to his knees, clutching the side of the boat, and struggled for a few seconds. "Thérèse! Thérèse!" he called in a stifling, sibilant voice. The young woman looked at him, clinging with both hands to the seat. The skiff creaked and danced upon the river. She could not close her eyes. A frightful contraction kept them wide open, riveted on the hideous struggle. She remained rigid and mute. "Thérèse! Thérèse!" again cried the unfortunate man, who was in the throes of death. At this final appeal, Thérèse burst into sobs. Her nerves had given way. The attack she had been dreading cast her to the bottom of the boat, where she remained doubled up in a swoon as if dead. Laurent continued tugging at Camille, pressing with one hand on his throat. With the other hand he ended by tearing his victim away from the side of the skiff, and held him high up in the air in his powerful arms, like a child. As he bent down his head, his victim, mad with rage and terror, twisted himself round, and reaching forward with his teeth, buried them in the neck of his aggressor. And when the murderer, restraining a yell of pain, abruptly flung the clerk into the river, the latter carried a piece of his flesh away with him. Camille fell into the water with a shriek. He returned to the surface 2 or 3 times, uttering cries that were more and more hollow. Laurent, without losing a second, raised the collar of his coat to hide his wound, then seizing the unconscious Thérèse in his arms, he capsized the skiff with his foot, as he fell into the Seine with a young woman, whom he supported on the surface while calling in a lamentable voice for help. The boating party he had heard singing behind the point of the island, understanding that an accident had happened, advanced with long, rapid strokes of the oars and rescued the emerged couple. While Thérèse was laid on a bench, Laurent gave vent to his despair at the death of his friend. Plunging into the water again, he reached for Camille in places where he knew he was not to be found, and returned in tears, wringing his hands and tearing his hair, while the boating party did their best to calm and console him. "It's all my fault," he exclaimed. "I ought never to have allowed that poor fellow to dance and move about as he did. At a certain moment we all three found ourselves on one side of the boat, and we capsized. As we fell into the water, he shouted out to me to save his wife." In accordance with what usually happens under similar circumstances, 3 or 4 of the young fellows amongst the boating party maintained they had witnessed the accident. "We saw you well enough," they said, "and then, hang it all, a boat is not so firm as a dancing floor. Oh, the poor little woman! It'll be a nice awakening for her." They took their oars, and towing the capsized skiff behind them, conducted Thérèse and Laurent to the restaurant, where the dinner was ready to be served. The restaurant keeper and his wife were worthy people, who placed their wardrobe at the service of the drenched pair. When Thérèse recovered consciousness, she had a nervous attack, and burst into heart-rending sobs. It became necessary to put her to bed. Nature assisted the sinister comedy that had just been performed. As soon as the young woman became calmer, Laurent, entrusting her to the care of the host and his wife, set out to return to Paris, where he wished to arrive alone to break the frightful intelligence to Madame Raquin with all possible precautions. The truth was that he feared the nervous, feverish excitement of Thérèse, and preferred to give her time to reflect and learn her part. It was the boating men who sat down to the dinner prepared for Camille. End of chapter 11. Recording by Nicholas Stevenson, Task, France. Chapter 12 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Stevenson. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernst Alfred Viztelli. Chapter 12. Laurent, in the dark corner of the omnibus that took him back to Paris, continued perfecting his plan. He was almost certain of impunity, and he felt heavy, anxious joy, the joy of having got over the crime. On reaching the gate at Clichy, he hailed a cab and drove to the residence of old Michaud in the Rue de Seine. It was 9 o'clock at night when he arrived. He found the former commissary of police at table in the company of Olivier and Suzanne. The motive of his visit was to seek protection in case he should be suspected, and also to escape breaking the frightful news to Madame Raquin himself. Such an errand was strangely repugnant to him. He anticipated encountering such terrible despair that he feared he would be unable to play his part with sufficient tears. Then the grief of this mother weighed upon him, although at the bottom of his heart he cared but little about it. When Michaud saw him enter clothed in coarse-looking garments that were far too tight for him, he questioned him with his eyes, and Laurent gave an account of the accident in a broken voice, as if exhausted with grief and fatigue. "I have come to you," he said in conclusion, "because I do not know what to do about the 2 poor women so cruelly afflicted. I dare not go to the bereaved mother alone, and want you to accompany me." As he spoke, Olivier looked at him fixedly, and with so straight a glance that he terrified him. The murderer had flung himself head down among these people belonging to the police, with an audacity calculated to save him. But he could not repress a shudder as he felt their eyes examining him. He saw distrust where there was naught but stupor and pity. Suzanne, weaker and paler than usual, seemed ready to faint. Olivier, who was alarmed at the idea of death, but whose heart remained absolutely cold, made a grimace expressing painful surprise, while by habit he scrutinized the countenance of Laurent without having the least suspicion of the sinister truth. As to old Michaud, he uttered exclamations of fright, commiseration, and astonishment. He fidgeted on his chair, joined his hands together, and cast up his eyes to the ceiling. "Oh, good heavens!" said he in a broken voice. "Oh, good heavens, what a frightful thing! To leave one's home and die like that, all of a sudden, it's horrible. And that poor Madame Raquin, his mother, whatever shall we say to her? Certainly you were quite right to come and find us. We will go with you." Rising from his seat, he walked hither and thither about the apartment, stamping with his feet in search of his hat and walking stick, and as he bustled from corner to corner, he made Laurent repeat the details of the catastrophe, giving utterance to fresh exclamations at the end of each sentence. At last all four went downstairs. On reaching the entrance to the arcade on the Pont Neuf, Laurent was stopped by Michaud. "Do not accompany us any further," said he. "Your presence would be a sort of brutal avowal which must be avoided. The wretched mother would suspect a misfortune, and this would force us to confess the truth sooner than we ought to tell it to her. Wait for us here." This arrangement relieved the murderer, who shuddered at the thought of entering the shop in the arcade. He recovered his calm, and began walking up and down the pavement, going and coming in perfect peace of mind. At moments he forgot the events that were passing. He looked at the shops, whistled between his teeth, turned round to ogle the women who brushed past him. He remained thus for a full half-hour in the street, recovering his composure more and more. He had not eaten since the morning, and feeling hungry, he entered a pastry-cook's and stuffed himself with cakes. A heart-rending scene was passing at the shop in the arcade. Notwithstanding precautions, notwithstanding the soft, friendly sentences of old Michaud, there came a moment when Madame Raquin understood that her son had met with misfortune. From that moment, she insisted on knowing the truth with such a passionate outburst of despair, with such a violent flow of tears and shrieks, that her old friend could not avoid giving way to her. And when she learnt the truth, her grief was tragic. She gave hollow sobs. She received shocks that threw her backward in a distracting attack of terror and anguish. She remained there choking, uttering from time to time a piercing scream amidst the profound roar of her affliction. She would have dragged herself along the ground had not Suzanne taken her around the waist, weeping on her knees, and raising her pale countenance towards her. Olivier and his father on their feet, unnerved and mute, turned aside their heads, being disagreeably affected by this painful sight which wounded them in their egotism. The poor mother saw her son rolling along in the thick waters of the Seine, a rigid and horribly swollen corpse, while at the same time she perceived him as a babe in his cradle when she drove away death bending over him. She had brought him back into the world on more than 10 occasions. She loved him for all the love she had bestowed on him during 30 years, and now he had met his death far away from her, all at once, in the cold and dirty water like a dog. Then she remembered the warm blankets in which she had enveloped him. What care she had taken of her boy! What a tepid temperature he had been reared in! How she had coaxed and fondled him, and all this to see him one day miserably drown himself. At these thoughts Madame Raquin felt a tightening at the throat, and she hoped she was going to die, strangled by despair. Old Michaud hastened to withdraw. Leaving Suzanne behind to look after the mercer, he and Olivier went to find Laurent, so that they might hurry to Saint-Ouen with all speed. During the journey they barely exchanged a few words. Each of them buried himself in a corner of the cab which jolted along over the stones. There they remained motionless and mute in the obscurity that prevailed within the vehicle. Ever and anon a rapid flash from a gas lamp cast a bright gleam on their faces. The sinister event that had brought them together threw a sort of dismal dejection upon them. When they at length arrived at the restaurant beside the river, they found Thérèse in bed with burning head and hands. The landlord told them in an undertone that the young woman had a violent fever. The truth was that Thérèse, feeling herself weak in character and wanting in courage, feared she might confess the crime in one of her nervous attacks, and had decided to feign illness. Maintaining sullen silence, she kept her lips and eyes closed, unwilling to see anyone lest she should speak. With the bedclothes to her chin, her face half concealed by the pillow, she made herself quite small, anxiously listening to all that was said around her. And amidst the reddish gleam that passed beneath her closed lids, she could see Camille and Laurent struggling at the side of the boat. She perceived her husband, livid, horrible, increased in height, rearing up straight above the turbid water, and this implacable vision heightened the feverish heat in her blood. Old Michaud endeavoured to speak to her and console her, but she made a movement of impatience, and turning round, broke out into a fresh fit of sobbing. "Leave her alone, sir," said the restaurant-keeper. "She shudders at the slightest sound. You see, she wants rest." Below in the general room was a policeman drawing up the statement of the accident. Michaud and his son went downstairs, followed by Laurent. When Olivier had made himself known as the upper official at the prefecture of police, everything was over in 10 minutes. The boating men, who were still there, gave an account of the drowning in its smallest details, describing how the 3 holiday-makers had fallen into the water, as if they themselves had witnessed the misfortune. Had Olivier and his father the least suspicion, it would have been dispelled at once by this testimony. But they had not doubted the veracity of Laurent in this instant. On the contrary, they introduced him to the police as the best friend of the victim, and they were careful to see inserted in the report that the young man had plunged into the water to save Camille Raquin. The following day the newspapers related the accident with a great display of detail. The unfortunate mother, the inconsolable widow, the noble and courageous friend, nothing was missing from this event of the day, which went the round of the Parisian press and then found an echo in the provinces. When the report was completed, Laurent experienced lively joy, which penetrated his being like new life. From the moment his victim had burrowed his teeth in his neck, he had been as if stiffened, acting mechanically, according to a plan arranged long in advance. The instinct of self-preservation alone impelled him, dictating to him his words, affording him advice as to his gestures. At this hour, in the face of the certainty of impunity, the blood resumed flowing in his veins with delicious gentleness. The police had passed beside his crime, and had seen nothing. They had been duped, for they had just acquitted him. He was saved. This thought caused him to experience a feeling of delightful moisture all along his body, a warmth that restored flexibility to his limbs and to his intelligence. He continued to act his part of a weeping friend with incomparable science and assurance. At the bottom of his heart he felt with brutal satisfaction, and he thought of Thérèse, who was in bed in the room above. "We cannot leave this unhappy woman here," he said to Michaud. "She is perhaps threatened with grave illness. We must positively take her back to Paris. Come, let us persuade her to accompany us." Upstairs, he begged and prayed of Thérèse to rise and dress, and allowed herself to be conducted to the arcade of the Pont Neuf. When the young woman heard the sound of his voice, she started and stared at him with eyes wide open. She seemed as if crazy and was shuddering. Painfully she raised herself into a sitting posture without answering. The men quitted the room, leaving her alone with the wife of the restaurant keeper. When ready to start, she came downstairs staggering and was assisted into the cab by Olivier. The journey was a silent one. Laurent, with perfect audacity and impudence, slipped his hand along the skirt of Thérèse and caught her fingers. He was seated opposite her in a floating shadow, and could not see her face, which she kept bowed down on her breast. As soon as he had grasped her hand, he pressed it vigorously, retaining it until they reached the Rue Mazarine. He felt the hand tremble, but it was not withdrawn. On the contrary, it ever and anon gave a sudden caress. These two hands, one in the other, were burning, the moist palms adhered, and the fingers, tightly held together, were hurt at each pressure. It seemed to Laurent and Thérèse that the blood from one penetrated the chest of the other, passing through their joined fists. These fists became a live fire, whereupon their lives were boiling. Amidst the night, amidst the heart-rending silence that prevailed, the furious grips they exchanged were like a crushing weight cast on the head of Camille to keep him under water. When the cab stopped, Michaud and his son got out first, and Laurent, bending towards his sweetheart, gently murmured, "Be strong, Thérèse. We have a long time to wait. Recollect." Then the young woman opened her lids for the first time since the death of her husband. "Oh, I shall recollect," she said with a shudder, and in a voice light as a puff of breath. Olivier extended his hand, inviting her to get down. On this occasion, Laurent went as far as the shop. Madame Raquin was abed, a prey to violent delirium. Thérèse dragged herself to her room, where Suzanne had barely time to undress her before she gave way. Tranquillized, perceiving that everything was proceeding as well as he could wish, Laurent withdrew, and slowly gained his wretched den in the Rue Saint-Victor. It was past midnight. Fresh air circulated in the deserted, silent streets. The young man could hear naught but his own footsteps resounding on the pavement. The nocturnal coolness of the atmosphere cheered him up. The silence, the darkness gave him sharp sensations of delight, and he loitered on his way. At last he was rid of his crime. He had killed Camille. It was a matter that was settled and would be spoken of no more. He was now going to lead a tranquil existence until he could take possession of Thérèse. The thought of the murder had at times half choked him, and now that it was accomplished, he felt a weight removed from his chest, and breathed at ease, cured of the suffering that hesitation and fear had given him. At the bottom of his heart, he was a trifle abated. Fatigue had rendered his limbs and thoughts heavy. He went into bed and slept soundly. During his slumber, slight nervous crispations coursed over his face. End of chapter 12. Recording by Nicholas Stevenson. Task, France. Chapter 13 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Viztelli. Chapter 13. The following morning, Laurent awoke fresh and fit. He had slept well. The cold air entering by the open window whipped his sluggish blood. He had no clear recollection of the scenes of the previous day, and had it not been for the burning sensation at his neck, He might have thought that he had retired to rest after a calm evening. But the bite Camille had given him stung as if his skin had been branded with a red-hot iron. When his thoughts settled on the pain this gash caused him, he suffered cruelly. It seemed as though a dozen needles were penetrating little by little into his flesh. He turned down the collar of his shirt and examined the wound in a wretched 15-sou looking-glass hanging against the wall. It formed a red hole, as big as a penny piece. The skin had been torn away, displaying the rosy flesh, studded with dark specks. Streaks of blood had run as far as the shoulder in thin threads that had dried up. The bite looked a deep, dull brown colour against the white skin, and was situated under the right ear. Laurent scrutinized it with curved back and craned neck, and the greenish mirror gave his face an atrocious grimace. Satisfied with his examination, he had a thorough good wash, saying to himself that the wound would be healed in a few days. Then he dressed and quietly repaired to his office, where he related the accident in an affected tone of voice. When his colleagues had read the account in the newspapers, he became quite a hero. During a whole week, the clerks of the Orléans Railway had no other subject of conversation. They were all proud that one of their staff should have been drowned. Grivet never ceased his remarks on the imprudence of adventuring into the middle of the Seine, when it was so easy to watch the running water from the bridges. Laurent retained a feeling of intense uneasiness. The decease of Camille had not been formally proved. The husband of Thérèse was indeed dead, but the murderer would have liked to have found his body, so as to obtain a certificate of death. The day following the accident, a fruitless search had been made for the corpse of the drowned man. It was thought that it had probably gone to the bottom of some hole near the banks of the islands, and men were actively dragging the Seine to get the reward. In the meantime, Laurent imposed himself the task of passing each morning by the morgue on the way to the office. He had made up his mind to attend to the business himself. Notwithstanding that his heart rose with repugnance, notwithstanding the shudders that sometimes ran through his frame, for over a week he went and examined the countenance of all the drowned persons extended on the slabs. When he entered the place, an unsavoury odour, an odour of freshly washed flesh, disgusted him, and a chill ran over his skin. The dampness of the walls seemed to add weight to his clothing, which hung more heavily on his shoulders. He went straight to the glass separating the spectators from the corpses, and with his pale face against it, looked. Facing him appeared rows of grey slabs, and upon them, here and there, the naked bodies formed green and yellow, white and red patches. While some retained their natural condition in the rigidity of death, others seemed like lumps of bleeding and decaying meat. At the back, against the wall, hung some lamentable rags, petticoats and trousers, puckered against the bare plaster. Laurent at first only caught sight of the one ensemble of stones and walls, spotted with dabs of russet and black, formed by the clothes and corpses. A melodious sound of running water broke the silence. Little by little he distinguished the bodies, and went from one to the other. It was only the drowned that interested him. When several human forms were there, swollen and blued by the water, he looked at them eagerly, trying to recognize Camille. Frequently the flesh on the faces had gone away by strips, the bones had burst through the mellow skins, the visages were like lumps of boned, boiled beef. Laurent hesitated. He looked at the corpses, endeavouring to discover the lean body of his victim, but all the drowned were stout. He saw enormous stomachs, puffy thighs, and strong round arms. He did not know what to do. He stood there shuddering before these greenish-looking rags, which seemed like mocking him with their horrible wrinkles. One morning he was seized with real terror. For some moments he had been looking at a corpse taken from the water that was small in build and atrociously disfigured. The flesh of this drowned person was so soft and broken up that the running water washing it carried it away bit by bit. The jet falling on the face bored a hole to the left of the nose, and abruptly the nose became flat, the lips were detached, showing the white teeth. The head of the drowned man burst out laughing. Each time Laurent fancied he recognized Camille, he felt a burning sensation in the heart. He ardently desired to find the body of his victim, and he was seized with cowardice when he imagined it was before him. His visits to the morgue filled him with nightmare, with shudders that set him panting for breath. But he shook off his fear, taxing himself with being childish when he wished to be strong. Still, in spite of himself, his frame revolted. Disgust and horror gained possession of his being as soon as he found himself in the dampness, the unsavoury odour of the hall. When there were no drowned persons on the back row of the slabs, he breathed at ease. His repugnance was not so great. He then became a simple spectator, who took strange pleasure in looking death by violence in the face, in its lugubriously fantastic and grotesque attitudes. This sight amused him, particularly when there were women there displaying their bare bosoms. These nudities, brutally exposed, blood-stained, and in places bored with holes, attracted and detained him. Once he saw a young woman of 20 there, a child of the people, broad and strong, who seemed asleep on the stone, her fresh, plump, white form displaying the most delicate softness of tint. She was half smiling, with her head slightly inclined on one side. Around her neck she had a black band, which gave her a sort of necklet of shadow. She was a girl who had hanged herself in a fit of love madness. Each morning while Laurent was there, he heard behind him the coming and going of the public who entered and left. The morgue is a sight within reach of everybody, and one to which passers-by, rich and poor alike, treat themselves. The door stands open, and all are free to enter. There are admirers of the scene who go out of their way so as not to miss one of these performances of death. If the slabs have nothing on them, visitors leave with the building disappointed, feeling as if they have been cheated, and murmuring between their teeth. But when they are fairly well occupied, people crowd in front of them and treat themselves to cheap emotions. They express horror, they joke, they applaud or whistle, as at the theatre, and withdraw satisfied, declaring the morgue a success on that particular day. Laurent soon got to know the public frequenting the place, that mixed and dissimilar public who pity and sneer in common. Workmen looked in on their way to their work, with a loaf of bread and tools under their arms. They considered death droll. Among them were comical companions of the workshops, who elicited a smile from the onlookers by making witty remarks about the faces of each corpse. They styled those who had been burnt to death coalmen. The hanged, the murdered, the drowned, the bodies that had been stabbed or crushed, excited their jeering vivacity, and their voices, which slightly trembled, stammered out comical sentences amid the shuddering silence of the hall. There came persons of small independent means, old men who were thin and shrivelled up, idlers who entered because they had nothing to do, and who looked at the bodies in a silly manner, with the pouts of peaceful, delicate-minded men. Women were there in great numbers, young working girls, all rosy with white linen and clean petticoats, who tripped along briskly from one end of the glazed partition to the other, opening great attentive eyes, as if they were before the dressed shop window of a linen draper. There were also women of the lower orders, looking stupefied, and giving themselves lamentable airs, and well-dressed ladies, carelessly dragging their silk gowns along the floor. On a certain occasion, Laurent noticed one of the latter standing a few paces from the glass, and pressing her cambric handkerchief to her nostrils. She wore a delicious grey silk skirt with a large black lace mantle. Her face was covered by a veil, and her gloved hands seemed quite small and delicate. Around her hung a gentle perfume of violet. She stood scrutinizing a corpse. On a slab a few paces away was stretched the body of a great, big fellow, a mason who had recently killed himself on the spot by falling from a scaffolding. He had a broad chest, large short muscles, and a white, well-nourished body. Death had made a marble statue of him. The lady examined him, turned him round, and weighed him, so to say, with her eyes. For a time she seemed quite absorbed in the contemplation of this man. She raised a corner of her veil for one last look. Then she withdrew. At moments bands of lads arrived, young people between 12 and 15, who leant with their hands against the glass, nudging one another with their elbows and making brutal observations. At the end of a week, Laurent became disheartened. At night he dreamt of the corpse he had seen in the morning. This suffering, this daily disgust which he imposed upon himself, ended by troubling him to such a point that he resolved to pay only 2 more visits to the place. The next day, on entering the morgue, he received a violent shock in the chest. Opposite him, on a slab, Camille lay looking at him, extended on his back, his head raised, his eyes half open. The murderer slowly approached the glass, as if attracted there, unable to detach his eyes from his victim. He did not suffer. He merely experienced a greater inner chill, accompanied by slight pricks on his skin. He would have thought that he would have trembled more violently. For fully 5 minutes he stood motionless, lost in unconscious contemplation, engraving, in spite of himself, in his memory, all the horrible lines, all the dirty colours of the picture he had before his eyes. Camille was hideous. He had been a fortnight in the water. His face still appeared firm and rigid, the features were preserved, but the skin had taken a yellowish, muddy tint. The thin, bony, and slightly tumefied head wore a grimace. It was a trifle inclined on one side, with the hair sticking to the temples and the lids raised, displaying the dull globes of the eyes, while preserving a human appearance, had remained all the more frightful with pain and terror. The body seemed a mass of ruptured flesh. It had suffered horribly. You could feel that the arms no longer held to their sockets, and the clavicles were piercing the skin of the shoulders. The ribs formed black bands on the greenish chest. The left side, ripped open, was gaping amidst dark red shreds. All the torso was in a state of putrefaction. The extended legs, although firmer, were daubed with dirty patches. The feet dangled down. Laurent gazed at Camille. He had never yet seen the body of a drowned person presenting such a dreadful aspect. The corpse, moreover, looked pinched. It had a thin, poor appearance. It had shrunk up in its decay, and the heap it formed was quite small. Anyone might have guessed that it belonged to a clerk of 1,200 francs a year, who was stupid and sickly, and who had been brought up by his mother on infusions. This miserable frame, which had grown to maturity between warm blankets, was now shivering on a cold slab. When Laurent could at last tear himself from the poignant curiosity that kept him motionless and gaping before his victim, he went out and began walking rapidly along the quay, and as he stepped out he repeated, "That is what I have done. He is hideous." A smell seemed to be following him, the smell that the putrefying body must be giving off. He went to find old Michaud, and told him he had just recognized Camille lying on one of the slabs in the morgue. The formalities were performed. The drowned man was buried, and a certificate of death delivered. Laurent, henceforth at ease, felt delighted to be able to bury his crime in oblivion, along with the vexations and painful scenes that had followed it. Chapter 13. Recording by Nicholas Stevenson, France.
Chapter 14 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetli. Chapter 14. The shop in the arcade of the Pont Neuf remained closed for 3 days. When it opened again, it appeared darker and damper. The shop front display, which the dust had turned yellow, seemed to be wearing the mourning of the house. The various articles were scattered at 6s and 7s in the dirty windows. Behind the linen caps hanging from the rusty iron rods, the face of Thérèse presented a more olive, a more sallow pallidness, and the immobility of sinister calm. All the gossips in the arcade were moved to pity. The dealer in imitation jewelry pointed out the emaciated profile of the young widow to each of her customers as an interesting and lamentable curiosity. For 3 days, Madame Raquin and Thérèse had remained in bed without speaking, and without even seeing one another. The old mercer, propped up by pillows in a sitting posture, gazed vaguely before her with the eyes of an idiot. The death of her son had been like a blow on the head that had felled her senseless to the ground. For hours she remained tranquil and inert, absorbed in her despair. Then she was at times seized with attacks of weeping, shrieking, and delirium. Thérèse in the adjoining room seemed to sleep. She had turned her face to the wall and drawn the sheet over her eyes. There she lay stretched out at full length, rigid and mute, without a sob raising the bedclothes. It looked as if she was concealing the thoughts that made her rigid in the darkness of the alcove. Suzanne, who attended to the 2 women, went feebly from one to the other, gently dragging her feet along the floor, bending her wax-like countenance over the 2 couches, without succeeding in persuading Thérèse, who had certain fits of impatience, to turn round, or in consoling Madame Raquin, whose tears began to flow as soon as a voice drew her from her prostration. On the 3rd day, Thérèse, rapidly and with a sort of feverish decision, threw the sheet from her and seated herself up in bed. She thrust back her hair from her temples, and for a moment remained with her hands to her forehead and her eyes fixed, seeming still to reflect. Then she sprang to the carpet. Her limbs were shivering and red with fever. Large livid patches marbled her skin, which had become wrinkled in places as if she had lost flesh. She had grown older. Suzanne, on entering the room, was struck with surprise to find her up. In a placid, drolling tone, she advised her to go to bed again and continue resting. Thérèse paid no heed to her, but sought her clothes and put them on with hurried, trembling gestures. When she was dressed, she went and looked at herself in a glass, rubbing her eyes and passing her hands over her countenance as if to efface something. Then, without pronouncing a syllable, she quickly crossed the dining-room and entered the apartment occupied by Madame Raquin. She caught the old mercer in a moment of doltish calm. When Thérèse appeared, she turned her head following the movements of the young widow with her eyes, while the latter came and stood before her, mute and oppressed. The 2 women contemplated one another for some seconds, the niece with increasing anxiety, the aunt with painful efforts of memory. Madame Raquin, at last remembering, stretched out her trembling arms, and, taking Thérèse by the neck, exclaimed, "My poor child! My poor Camille!" She wept, and her tears dried on the burning skin of the young widow, who concealed her own dry eyes in the folds of the sheet. Thérèse remained bending down, allowing the old mother to exhaust her outburst of grief. She had dreaded this first interview ever since the murder, and had kept in bed to delay it, to reflect at ease on the terrible part she had to play. When she perceived Madame Raquin more calm, she busied herself about her, advising her to rise and go down to the shop. The old mercer had almost fallen into dotage. The abrupt apparition of her niece had brought about a favorable crisis that had just restored her memory, and the consciousness of things and beings around her. She thanked Suzanne for her attention. Although weakened, she talked and had ceased wandering, but she spoke in a voice so full of sadness that at moments she was half choked. She watched the movements of Thérèse with sudden fits of tears, and would then call her to the bedside and embrace her amid more sobs, telling her in a suffocating tone that she, now, had nobody but her in the world. In the evening, she consented to get up and make an effort to eat. Thérèse then saw what a terrible shock her aunt had received. The legs of the old lady had become so ponderous that she required a stick to assist her to drag herself into the dining-room, and there she thought the walls were vacillating around her. Nevertheless, the following day she wished the shop to be opened. She feared she would go mad if she continued to remain alone in her room. She went down the wooden staircase with heavy tread, placing her 2 feet on each step, and seated herself behind the counter. From that day forth, she remained riveted there in placid affliction. Thérèse, beside her, mused and waited. The shop resumed its gloomy calm. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nadine Eckert-Boulet. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetli. Chapter 15. Laurent resumed calling of an evening every 2 or 3 days, remaining in the shop talking to Madame Raquin for half an hour. Then he went off without looking Thérèse in the face. The old mercer regarded him as the rescuer of her niece, as a noble-hearted young man who had done his utmost to restore her son to her, and she welcomed him with tender kindness. One Thursday evening, when Laurent happened to be there, old Michaud and Grivet entered. 8 o'clock was striking. The clerk and the former commissary of police had both thought, independently of one another, that they could resume their dear custom, without appearing importunate, and they arrived at the same moment, as if urged by the same impulse. Behind them came Olivier and Suzanne. Every one went upstairs to the dining-room. Madame Raquin, who expected nobody, hastened to light the lamp and prepare the tea. When all were seated round the table, each before a cup, when the box of dominoes had been emptied on the board, the old mother, with the past suddenly brought back to her, looked at her guests and burst into sobs. There was a vacant place, that of her son. This despair cast a chill upon the company and annoyed them. Every countenance wore an air of egoistic beatitude. These people felt ill at ease, having no longer the slightest recollection of Camille alive in their hearts. "Come, my dear lady," exclaimed old Michaud, slightly impatiently, "you must not give way to despair like that. You will make yourself ill." "We are all mortal," affirmed Grivet. "Your tears will not restore your son to you," sententiously observed Olivier. "Do not cause us pain, I beg you," murmured Suzanne. And as Madame Raquin sobbed louder, unable to restrain her tears, Michaud resumed, "Come, come, have a little courage. You know we come here to give you some distraction. Then do not let us feel sad. Let us try to forget. We are playing 2 sous a game. Eh? What do you say?" The mercer stifled her sobs with a violent effort. Perhaps she was conscious of the happy egotism of her guests. She dried her tears, but was still quite upset. The dominoes trembled in her poor hands, and the moisture in her eyes prevented her seeing. The game began. Laurent and Thérèse had witnessed this brief scene in a grave and impassive manner. The young man was delighted to see these Thursday evenings resumed. he ardently desired them to be continued, aware that he would have need of these gatherings to attain his end. Besides, without asking himself the reason, he felt more at ease among these few persons whom he knew, and it gave him courage to look Thérèse in the face. The young woman, attired in black, pale and meditative, seemed to him to possess a beauty that he had hitherto ignored. He was happy to meet her eyes, and to see them rest upon his own with courageous fixedness. Thérèse still belonged to him, heart and soul. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of Therese Raquin by Emile Zola. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Bologna Times. A fortnight passed. The bitterness of the first hours was softening. Each day brought additional tranquillity and calm. Life resumed its course with weary languidness, and with the monotonous intellectual insensibility which follows great shocks. At the commencement, Laurent and Thérèse allowed themselves to drift into this new existence, which was transforming them. Within their beings was proceeding a silent labor which would require analyzing with extreme delicacy if one desired to mark all its phases. It was not long before Laurent came every night to the shop as formerly, but he no longer dined there. He no longer made the place a lounge during the entire evening. He arrived at 9:30, and remained until he had put up the shutters. It seemed as if he was accomplishing a duty and placing himself at the service of the two women. If he happened occasionally to neglect the tiresome job, he apologized with the humility of the following day. On Thursdays he assisted Madame Raquin to light the fire, to do the honors of the house, and displayed all kinds of gentle attentions that charmed the old mercer. Thérèse peacefully watched the activity of his movements round about her. The pallidness of her face had departed. She appeared in better health, more smiling and gentle. It was only rarely that her lips, becoming pinched in a nervous contraction, produced two deep pleats which conveyed to her countenance a strange expression of grief and fright. The two sweethearts no longer sought to see one another in private. Not once did they suggest a meeting, nor did they ever furtively exchange a kiss. The murder seemed to have momentarily appeased their warmth. In killing Camille, they had succeeded in satisfying their passion. Their crime appeared to have given them a keen pleasure that sickened and disgusted them of their embraces. They had 1,000 facilities for enjoying the freedom that had been their dream, and the attainment of which had urged them on to murder. Madame Raquin, impotent and childish, ceased to be an obstacle. The house belonged to them. They could go abroad where they pleased. But love did not trouble them. Its fire had died out. They remained there, calmly talking, looking at one another without reddening and without a thrill. They even avoided being alone. In their intimacy, they found nothing to say, and both were afraid that they appeared too cold. When they exchanged a pressure of the hand, they experienced a sort of discomfort at the touch of their skins. Both imagined they could explain what made them so indifferent and alarmed when face to face with one another. They put the coldness of their attitude down to prudence. Their calm, according to them, was the result of great caution on their part. They pretended they desired this tranquillity and somnolence of their hearts. On the other hand, they regarded the repugnance, the uncomfortable feeling experienced as a remains of terror, as the secret dread of punishment. Sometimes, forcing themselves to hope, they sought to resume the burning dreams of other days, and were quite astonished to find that they had no imagination. Then they clung to the idea of their forthcoming marriage. They fancied that having attained their end, without a single fear to trouble them, delivered over to one another, their passion would burn again, and they would taste the delights that had been their dream. This prospect brought them calm, and prevented them descending to the void hollowed out beneath them. They persuaded themselves they loved one another, as in the past, and they awaited the moment when they were to be perfectly happy, bound together forever. Never had Thérèse possessed so placid a mind. She was certainly becoming better. All her implacable, natural will was giving way. She felt happy at night, alone in her bed. No longer did she find the thin face and piteous form of Camille at her side to exasperate her. She imagined herself a little girl, a maid beneath the white curtains, lying peacefully amidst the silence and darkness. Her spacious and slightly cold room rather pleased her, with its lofty ceiling, its obscure corners, and its smack of the cloister. She even ended by liking the great black wall which rose up before her window. Every night, during one entire summer, she remained for hours gazing at the grey stones in this wall, and at the narrow strips of starry sky cut out by the chimneys and roofs. She only thought of Laurent when awakened with a start by nightmare. Then, sitting up, trembling, with dilated eyes, and pressing her nightdress to her, she said to herself that she would not experience these sudden fears if she had a man lying beside her. She thought of her sweetheart as of a dog who would have guarded and protected her. Of a daytime, in the shop, she took an interest in what was going on outside. She went out at her own instigation, and no longer lived in sullen revolt, occupied with thoughts of hatred and vengeance. It worried her to sit musing. She felt the necessity of acting and seeing. From morning to night she watched the people passing through the arcade. The noise and going and coming diverted her. She became inquisitive and talkative. In a word, a woman, for hitherto she had only displayed the actions and ideas of a man. From her point of observation, she remarked a young man, a student, who lived at an hotel in the neighborhood, and who passed several times daily before the shop. This youth had a handsome, pale face, with the long hair of a poet and the moustache of an officer. Thérèse thought him superior looking. She was in love with him for a week, in love like a schoolgirl. She read novels. She compared the young man to Laurent, and found the latter very coarse and heavy. Her reading revealed to her romantic scenes that, hitherto, she had ignored. She had only loved with blood and nerves, as yet, and she now began to love with her head. Then, one day, the student disappeared. No doubt he had moved. In a few hours, Thérèse had forgotten him. She now subscribed to a circulating library, and conceived a passion for the heroes of all the stories that passed under her eyes. This sudden love for reading had great influence on her temperament. She acquired nervous sensibility which caused her to laugh and cry without any motive. The equilibrium, which had shown a tendency to be established in her, was upset. She fell into a sort of vague meditation. At moments she became disturbed by thoughts of Camille, and she dreamt of Laurent and fresh love, full of terror and distrust. She again became a prey to anguish. At one moment she sought for the means of marrying her sweetheart at that very instant. At another she had an idea of running away never to see him again. The novels, which spoke to her of chastity and honor, placed a sort of obstacle between her instincts and her will. She remained the ungovernable creature who had wanted to struggle with the Seine, and who had thrown herself violently into illicit love. But she was conscious of goodness and gentleness. She understood the putty face and lifeless attitude of the wife of Olivier, and she knew it was possible to be happy without killing one's husband. Then she did not see herself in a very good light, and lived in cruel indecision. Laurent, on his side, passed through several different phases of love and fever. First of all, he enjoyed profound tranquillity. He seemed as if relieved of an enormous weight. At times he questioned himself with astonishment, fancying he had had a bad dream. He asked himself whether it was really true that he had flung Camille into the water, and had seen his corpse on the slab at the morgue. The recollection of his crime caused him strange surprise. Never could he have imagined himself capable of murder. He, so prudent, so cowardly, shuddered at the mere thought. Ice-like beads of perspiration stood out on his forehead when he reflected that the authorities might have discovered his crime and guillotined him. Then he felt the cold knife on his neck. So long as he had acted, he had gone straight before him, with the obstinacy and blindness of a brute. Now he turned round, and at the sight of the gulf he had just cleared, grew faint with terror. Assuredly, I must have been drunk, thought he. That woman must have intoxicated me with caresses. Good heavens, I was a fool and mad. I risked the guillotine in a business like that. Fortunately, it passed off all right, but if it had to be done again, I would not do it. Laurent lost all his vigor. He became inactive and more cowardly and prudent than ever. He grew fat and flabby. No one who had studied this great body, piled up in a lump, apparently without bones or muscles, would ever have had the idea of accusing the man of violence and cruelty. He resumed his former habits. For several months he proved himself a model clerk, doing his work with exemplary brutishness. At night he took his meal at a cheap restaurant in the Rue Saint-Victor, cutting his bread into thin slices, masticating his food slowly, making his repast last as long as possible. When it was over, he threw himself back against the wall and smoked his pipe. Anyone might have taken him for a stout, good-natured father. In the daytime he thought of nothing. At night he reposed in heavy sleep, free from dreams. With his face fat and rosy, his belly full, his brain empty, he felt happy. His frame seemed dead, and Thérèse barely entered his mind. Occasionally he thought of her as one thinks of a woman one has to marry later on, in the indefinite future. He patiently awaited the time for his marriage, forgetful of the bride, and dreaming of the new position he would then enjoy. He would leave his office, he would paint for amusement, and saunter about hither and thither. These hopes brought him night after night to the shop in the arcade, in spite of the vague discomfort he experienced on entering the place. One Sunday, with nothing to do, and being bored, he went to see his old school friend, the young painter he had lived with for a time. The artist was working on a picture of a nude bacchante sprawled on some drapery. The model, lying with her head thrown back and her torso twisted, sometimes laughed and threw her bosom forward, stretching her arms. As Laurent smoked his pipe and chatted with his friend, he kept his eye on the model. He took the woman home with him that evening, and kept her as his mistress for many months. The poor girl fell in love with him. Every morning she went off and posed as a model all day. Then she came back each evening. She didn't cost Laurent a penny, keeping herself out of her own earnings. Laurent never bothered to find out about her, where she went, what she did. She was a steadying influence in his life, a useful and necessary thing. He never wondered if he loved her, and he never considered that he was being unfaithful to Thérèse. He simply felt better and happier. In the meanwhile, the period of mourning that Thérèse had imposed on herself had come to an end, and the young woman put on light-colored gowns. One evening, Laurent found her looking younger and handsomer, but he still felt uncomfortable in her presence. For some time past, she seemed to him feverish and full of strange capriciousness, laughing and turning sad without reason. This unsettled demeanor alarmed him, for he guessed in part what her struggles and troubles must be like. He began to hesitate, having an atrocious dread of risking his tranquillity. He was now living peacefully, in wise contentment, and he feared to endanger the equilibrium of his life by binding himself to a nervous woman, whose passion had already driven him crazy. But he did not reason these matters out. He felt by instinct all the anguish he would be subjected to if he made Thérèse his wife. The first shock he received, and one that roused him to his sluggishness, was the thought that he must at length begin to think of his marriage. It was almost 15 months since the death of Camille. For an instant, Laurent had the idea of not marrying at all, of jilting Thérèse. Then he said to himself that it was no good killing a man for nothing. In recalling the crime, and the terrible efforts he had made to be the sole possessor of this woman who was now troubling him, he felt that the murder would become useless and atrocious should he not marry her. Besides, was he not bound to Thérèse by a bond of blood and horror? Moreover, he feared his accomplice. Perhaps, if he failed to marry her, she would go and relate everything to the judicial authorities out of vengeance and jealousy. With these ideas beating in his head, the fever settled on him again. Now, one Sunday the model did not return. No doubt she had found a warmer and more comfortable place to lodge. Laurent was only moderately upset, but he felt a sudden gap in his life without a woman lying beside him at night. In a week his passions rebelled, and he began spending entire evenings at the shop again. He watched Thérèse, who was still palpitating from the novels which she read. After a year of indifferent waiting, they both were again tormented by desire. One evening, while shutting up the shop, Laurent spoke to Thérèse in the passage. "Do you want me to come to your room tonight?" he asked passionately. She started with fear. "No, let's wait. Let's be prudent." "It seems to me that I've already waited a long time," he went on. "I'm sick of waiting." Thérèse, her hands and face burning hot, looked at him wildly. She seemed to hesitate, and then said quickly, "Let's get married." End of chapter 16.
Chapter 17 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Wiestilly. Chapter 17. Laurent left the arcade with a strained mind. Thérèse had filled him with the old longing lusts again. He walked along with his hat in his hand, so as to get the fresh air full in his face. On reaching the door of his hotel in the Rue Saint-Victor, he was afraid to go upstairs and remain alone. A childish, inexplicable, unforeseen terror made him fear he would find a man hidden in his garret. Never had he experienced such poltroonery. He did not even seek to account for the strange shudder that ran through him. He entered a wine shop and remained an hour there until midnight, motionless and silent at a table, mechanically absorbing great glasses of wine. Thinking of Thérèse, his anger raged at her refusal to have him in her room that very night. He felt that with her he would not have been afraid. When the time came for closing the shop, he was obliged to leave. But he went back again to ask for matches. The office of the hotel was on the first floor. Laurent had a long alley to follow and a few steps to ascend before he could take his candle. This alley, this bit of staircase which was frightfully dark, terrified him. Habitually, he passed boldly through the darkness. But on this particular night, he had not even the courage to ring. He said to himself that in a certain recess, formed by the entrance to the cellar, assassins were perhaps concealed, who would suddenly spring at his throat as he passed along. At last he pulled the bell, and lighting a match, made up his mind to enter the alley. The match went out. He stood motionless, breathless, without the courage to run away, rubbing lucifers against the damp wall in such anxiety that his hand trembled. He fancied he heard voices, and the sound of footsteps before him. The matches broke between his fingers, but he succeeded in striking one. The sulphur began to boil, to set fire to the wood, with a tardiness that increased his distress. In the pale bluish light of the sulphur, in the vacillating glimmer, he fancied he could distinguish monstrous forms. Then the match crackled, and the light became white and clear. Laurent, relieved, advanced with caution, careful not to be without a match. When he had passed the entrance to the cellar, he clung to the opposite wall where a mass of darkness terrified him. He next briskly scaled the few steps separating him from the office of the hotel, and thought himself safe when he held his candlestick. He ascended to the other floors more gently, holding aloft his candle, lighting all the corners before which he had to pass. The great fantastic shadows that come and go in ascending a staircase with a light caused him vague discomfort, as they suddenly rose and disappeared before him. As soon as he was upstairs, and had rapidly opened his door and shut himself in, his first care was to look under his bed, and make a minute inspection of the room to see that nobody was concealed there. He closed the window in the roof, thinking someone might perhaps get in that way, and feeling more calm after taking these measures, he undressed, astonished at his cowardice. He ended by laughing and calling himself a child. Never had he been afraid, and he could not understand this sudden fit of terror. He went to bed. When he was in the warmth beneath the bedclothes, he again thought of Thérèse, whom fright had driven from his mind. Do what he would, obstinately close his eyes and endeavour to sleep. Do what he would, obstinately close his eyes, endeavour to sleep, he felt his thoughts at work commanding his attention, connecting one with the other, to ever point out to him the advantage he would reap by marrying as soon as possible. Ever and anon he would turn round, saying to himself, "I must not think any more. I shall have to get up at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning to go to my office." And he made an effort to slip off to sleep. But the ideas returned one by one. The dull labour of his reasoning began again, and he soon found himself in a sort of acute reverie that displayed to him in the depths of his brain the necessity for his marriage, along with the arguments his desire and prudence advanced in turn for and against the possession of Thérèse. Then, seeing he was unable to sleep, that insomnia kept his body in a state of irritation, he turned on his back, and with his eyes wide open gave up his mind to the young woman. His equilibrium was upset, he again trembled with violent fever as formerly. He had an idea of getting up and returning to the arcade of the Pont Neuf. He would have the iron gate opened, and Thérèse would receive him. The thought sent his blood racing. The lucidity of his reverie was astonishing. He saw himself in the streets, walking rapidly beside the houses, and he said to himself, "I will take this boulevard, I will cross this square so as to arrive there quicker." Then the iron gate of the arcade grated. He followed the narrow, dark, deserted corridor, congratulating himself at being able to go up to Thérèse without being seen by the dealer in imitation jewellery. Next, he imagined he was in the alley, in the little staircase he had so frequently ascended. He inhaled the sickly odour of the passage, he touched the sticky walls, he saw the dirty shadow that hung about there. And he ascended each step, breathless, and with his ear on the alert. At last he scratched against the door opened, and Thérèse stood there, awaiting him. His thoughts unfolded before him like real scenes. With his eyes fixed on darkness, he saw. When, at the end of his journey through the streets, after entering the arcade, and climbing the little staircase, he thought he perceived Thérèse ardent and pale, he briskly sprang from his bed, murmuring, "I must go there, she is waiting for me." This abrupt movement drove away the hallucination. He felt the chill of the tile flooring and was afraid. For a moment he stood motionless on his bare feet, listening. He fancied he heard a sound on the landing, and he reflected that if he went to Thérèse, he would again have to pass before the door of the cellar below. This thought sent a cold shiver down his back. Again he was seized with fright, a sort of stupid, crushing terror. He looked distrustfully round the room, where he distinguished shreds of whitish light. Then gently, with anxious, hasty precautions, he went to bed again, and there, huddling himself together, hid himself, as if to escape a weapon, a knife, that threatened him. The blood had flown violently to his neck, which was burning him. He put his hand there, and beneath his fingers felt the scar of the bite he had received from Camille. He had almost forgotten this wound, and was terrified when he found it on his skin, where it seemed to be gnawing into his flesh. He rapidly withdrew his hand, so as not to feel the scar, but he was still conscious of its being there, boring into and devouring his neck. Then, when he delicately scratched it with his nail, the terrible burning sensation increased twofold. So as not to tear the skin, He pressed his 2 hands between his doubled-up knees, and he remained thus rigid and irritated, with a gnawing pain in his neck and his teeth chattering with fright. His mind now settled on Camille with frightful tenacity. Hitherto the drowned man had not troubled him at night. And behold, the thought of Thérèse brought up the spectre of her husband. The murderer dared not open his eyes, afraid of perceiving his victim in a corner of the room. At one moment he fancied his bedstead was being shaken in a peculiar manner. He imagined Camille was beneath it, and that it was he who was tossing him about in this way so as to make him fall and bite him. With haggard look and hair on end, he clung to his mattress, imagining the jerks were becoming more and more violent. Then he perceived the bed was not moving, and he felt a reaction. He sat up, lit his candle, and taxed himself with being an idiot. He next swallowed a large glassful of water to appease his fever. "I was wrong to drink at that wine shop," thought he. "I don't know what is the matter with me tonight. It's silly, I shall be worn out tomorrow at my office. I ought to have gone to sleep at once when I got into bed, instead of thinking of a lot of things. This is what gave me insomnia. I must get to sleep at once." Again he blew out the light. He buried his head in the pillow, feeling slightly refreshed, and thoroughly determined not to think any more, and to be no more afraid. Fatigue began to relax his nerves. He did not fall into his usual heavy, crushing sleep, but glided lightly into unsettled slumber. He simply felt as if benumbed, as if plunged into gentle and delightful stupor. As he dozed, he could feel his limbs. His intelligence remained awake in his deadened frame. He had driven away his thoughts, he had resisted the vigil. Then, when he became appeased, when his strength failed and his will escaped him, his thoughts returned quietly, one by one, regaining possession of his faltering being. His reverie began once more. Again he went over the distance separating him from Thérèse. He went downstairs. He passed before the cellar at a run, and found himself outside the house. He took all the streets he had followed before, when he was dreaming with his eyes open. He entered the arcade of the Pont Neuf, ascended the little staircase, and scratched at the door. But instead of Thérèse, it was Camille who opened the door. Camille, just as he had seen him at the morgue, looking greenish and atrociously disfigured. The corpse extended his arms to him with a vile laugh, displaying the tip of a blackish tongue between its white teeth. Laurent shrieked and awoke with a start. He was bathed in perspiration. He pulled the bedclothes over his eyes, swearing and getting into a rage with himself. He wanted to go to sleep again, and he did so as before, slowly. The same feeling of heaviness overcame him, and as soon as his will had again escaped in the languidness of semi-slumber, he set out again. He returned where his fixed idea conducted him. He ran to see Thérèse, and once more it was the drowned man who opened the door. The wretch sat up, terrified. He would have given anything in the world to be able to drive away this implacable dream. He longed for heavy sleep to crush his thoughts. So long as he remained awake, he had sufficient energy to expel the phantom of his victim, but, as soon as he lost command of his mind, it led him to the acme of terror. He again attempted to sleep. Then came a succession of delicious spells of drowsiness, and abrupt, harrowing awakenings. In his furious obstinacy, he still went to Thérèse, but only to always run against the body of Camille. He performed the same journey more than 10 times over. He started all afire, followed the same itinerary, experienced the same sensations, accomplished the same acts with minute exactitude. And more than 10 times over, he saw the drowned man present himself to be embraced, when he extended his arms to seize and clasp his love. This same sinister catastrophe which awoke him on each occasion, gasping and distracted, did not discourage him. After an interval of a few minutes, as soon as he had fallen asleep again, forgetful of the hideous corpse awaiting him, he once more hurried away to seek the young woman. Laurent passed an hour a prey to these successive nightmares, to these bad dreams that followed one another ceaselessly without any warning, and he was struck with more acute terror at each start they gave him. The last of these shocks proved so violent, so painful, that he determined to get up and struggle no longer. Day was breaking. A gleam of dull grey light was entering at the window in the roof, which cut out a pale grey square in the sky. Laurent slowly dressed himself with a feeling of sullen irritation, exasperated at having been unable to sleep, exasperated at allowing himself to be caught by a fright which he now regarded as childish. As he drew on his trousers, he stretched himself, he rubbed his limbs, he passed his hands over his face, harassed and clouded by a feverish night, and he repeated, "I ought not to have thought of all that, I should have gone to sleep. Had I done so, I should be fresh and well disposed now." Then it occurred to him that if he had been with Thérèse, she would have prevented him being afraid, and this idea brought him a little calm. At the bottom of his heart, he dreaded passing other nights similar to the one he had just gone through. After splashing some water in his face, he ran the comb through his hair, and this bit of toilet, while refreshing his head, drove away the final vestiges of terror. He now reasoned freely, and experienced no other inconvenience from his restless night than great fatigue in all his limbs. "I am not a poltroon, though," he said to himself as he finished dressing. "I don't care a fig about Camille. It's absurd to think that this poor devil is under my bed. I shall perhaps have the same idea now every night. I must certainly marry as soon as possible. When Thérèse has me in her arms, I shall not think much about Camille. She will kiss me on the neck, and I shall cease to feel the atrocious burn that troubles me at present. Let me examine this bite." He approached his glass, extended his neck and looked. The scar presented a rosy appearance. Then Laurent, perceiving the marks of the teeth of his victim, experienced a certain emotion. The blood flew to his head, and he now observed a strange phenomenon. The ruby blood rushing to the scar had turned it purple. It became raw and sanguineous, standing out quite red against the fat white neck. Laurent at the same time felt a sharp pricking sensation, as if needles were being thrust into the wound, and he hurriedly raised the collar of his shirt again. "Bah!" he exclaimed, "Thérèse will cure that. A few kisses will suffice. What a fool I am to think of these matters." He put on his hat and went downstairs. He wanted to be in the open air and walk. Passing before the door of the cellar, he smiled. Nevertheless, he made sure of the strength of the hook fastening the door. Outside on the deserted pavement, he moved along with short steps in the fresh matutinal air. It was then about 5 o'clock. Laurent passed an atrocious day. He had to struggle against the overpowering drowsiness that settled on him in the afternoon at his office. His heavy, aching head nodded in spite of himself, and he abruptly brought it up, as soon as he heard the step of one of his chiefs. This struggle, these shocks completed wearing out his limbs, while causing him intolerable anxiety. In the evening, notwithstanding his lassitude, he went to see Thérèse, only to find her feverish, extremely low-spirited, and as weary as himself. "Our poor Thérèse has had a bad night," Madame Raquin said to him, as soon as he had seated himself. "It seems she was suffering from nightmare and terrible insomnia. I heard her crying out on several occasions. This morning she was quite ill." Thérèse, while her aunt was speaking, looked fixedly at Laurent. No doubt they guessed their common terror, for a nervous shudder ran over their countenances. Until 10 o'clock they remained face to face with one another, talking of commonplace matters, but still understanding each other, and mutually imploring themselves with their eyes to hasten the moment when they could unite against the drowned man. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Thérèse Raquin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Mackenzie. Thérèse Raquin by Emile Zola. Translated by Ernest Alfred Vizetelly. Chapter 18. Thérèse also had been visited by the spectre of Camille during this feverish night. After over a year of indifference, Laurent's sudden attentions had aroused her senses. As she tossed herself about in insomnia, she had seen the drowned man rise up before her. Like Laurent, she had writhed in terror, and she had said as he had done, that she would no longer be afraid, that she would no more experience such sufferings when she had her sweetheart in her arms. This man and woman had experienced at the same hour a sort of nervous disorder which set them panting with terror. A consanguinity had become established between them. They shuddered with the same shudder. Their hearts, in a kind of poignant friendship, were wrung with the same anguish. From that moment they had one body and one soul for enjoyment and suffering. This communion, this mutual penetration, is a psychological and physiological phenomenon which is often found to exist in beings who have been brought into violent contact by great nervous shocks. For over a year Thérèse and Laurent lightly bore the chain riveted to their limbs that united them. In the depression succeeding the acute crisis of the murder, amidst the feelings of disgust and the need for calm and oblivion that had followed, these two convicts might fancy they were free, that they were no longer shackled together by iron fetters. The slackened chain dragged on the ground. They reposed. They found themselves struck with a sort of delightful insensibility. They sought to love elsewhere, to live in a state of wise equilibrium. But from the day when, urged forward by events, they came to the point of again exchanging burning sentences, the chain became violently strained, and they received such a shock that they felt themselves for ever linked to one another. The day following this first attack of nightmare, Thérèse secretly set to work to bring about her marriage with Laurent. It was a difficult task, full of peril. The sweethearts trembled lest they should commit an imprudence, arouse suspicions, and too abruptly reveal the interest they had in the death of Camille. Convinced that they could not mention marriage themselves, they arranged a very clever plan which consisted in getting Madame Raquin herself and the Thursday evening guests to offer them what they dared not ask for. It then only became necessary to convey to these worthy people the idea of remarrying Thérèse, and particularly to make them believe that this idea originated with themselves and was their own. The comedy was long and delicate to perform. Thérèse and Laurent took the parts adapted to them, and proceeded with extreme prudence, calculating the slightest gesture and the least word. At the bottom of their hearts they were devoured by a feeling of impatience that stiffened and strained their nerves. They lived in a state of constant irritation, and it required all their natural cowardice to compel them to show a smiling and peaceful exterior. If they yearned to bring the business to an end, it was because they could no longer remain separate and solitary. Each night the drowned man visited them. Insomnia stretched them on beds of live coal and turned them over with fiery tongs. The state of enervation in which they lived nightly increased the fever of their blood, which resulted in atrocious hallucinations rising up before them. Thérèse no longer dared enter her room after dusk. She experienced the keenest anguish when she had to shut herself until morning in this large apartment, which became lit up with strange glimmers and peopled with phantoms as soon as the light was out. She ended by leaving her candle burning, and by preventing herself falling asleep, so as to always have her eyes wide open. But when fatigue lowered her lids, she saw Camille in the dark, and reopened her eyes with a start. In the morning she dragged herself about, broken down, having only slumbered for a few hours at dawn. As to Laurent, he had decidedly become a poltroon since the night he had taken fright when passing before the cellar door. Previous to that incident he had lived with the confidence of a brute. Now, at the least sound, he trembled and turned pale like a little boy. A shudder of terror had suddenly shaken his limbs and had clung to him. At night he suffered even more than Thérèse, and fright in this great, soft, cowardly frame produced profound laceration to the feelings. He watched the fall of day with cruel apprehension. On several occasions he failed to return home, and passed whole nights walking in the middle of the deserted streets. Once he remained beneath a bridge until morning, while the rain poured down in torrents, and there, huddled up, half frozen, not daring to rise and ascend to the quay, he for nearly 6 hours watched the dirty water running in the whitest shadow. At times a fit of terror brought him flat down on the damp ground. Under one of the arches of the bridge he seemed to see long lines of drowned bodies drifting along in the current. When weariness drove him home, he shut himself in and double-locked the door. There he struggled until daybreak amidst frightful attacks of fever. The same nightmare returned persistently. He fancied he fell from the ardent clasp of Thérèse into the cold, sticky arms of Camille. He dreamt, first of all, that his sweetheart was stifling him in a warm embrace. and then that the corpse of the drowned man pressed him to his chest in an ice-like strain. These abrupt and alternate sensations of voluptuousness and disgust, these successive contacts of burning love and frigid death, set him panting for breath and caused him to shudder and gasp in anguish. Each day the terror of the lovers increased, each day their attacks of nightmare crushed and maddened them the more. They no longer relied on their kisses to drive away insomnia. By prudence they did not dare make appointments, but looked forward to their wedding day as a day of salvation, to be followed by an untroubled night. It was the desire for calm slumber that made them wish for their union. They had hesitated during the hours of indifference, both being oblivious of the egotistic and impassioned reasons that had urged them to the crime, and which were now dispelled. It was in vague despair that they took the supreme resolution to unite openly. At the bottom of their hearts they were afraid. They had leant, so to say, one on the other above an unfathomable depth, attracted to it by its horror. They bent over the abyss together, clinging silently to one another, while feelings of intense giddiness enfeebled their limbs and gave them falling madness. But at the present moment, face to face with their anxious expectation and timorous desires, they felt the imperative necessity of closing their eyes and of dreaming of a future full of amorous felicity and peaceful enjoyment. The more they trembled one before the other, the better they foresaw the horror of the abyss to the bottom of which they were about to plunge, and the more they sought to make promises of happiness to themselves, and to spread out before their eyes the invincible facts that fatally led them to marriage. Thérèse desired her union with Laurent solely because she was afraid and wanted a companion. She was a prey to nervous attacks that drove her half crazy. In reality she reasoned but little. She flung herself into love with a mind upset by the novels she had recently been reading, and a frame irritated by the cruel insomnia that had kept her awake for several weeks. Laurent, who was of a stouter constitution, while giving way to his terror and his desire, had made up his mind to reason out his decision, to thoroughly prove to himself that his marriage was necessary, that he was at last going to be perfectly happy, and to drive away the vague fears that beset him, he resumed all his former calculations. His father, the peasant of Jefosse, seemed determined not to die, and Laurent said to himself that he might have to wait a long time for the inheritance. He even feared that this inheritance might escape him and go into the pockets of one of his cousins, a great big fellow who turned the soil over to the keen satisfaction of the old boy, and he would remain poor. He would live the life of a bachelor in a garret, with a bad bed and a worse table. Besides, he did not contemplate working all his life. Already he began to find his office singularly tedious. The light labour entrusted to him became irksome owing to his laziness. The invariable result of these reflections was that supreme happiness consisted in doing nothing. Then he remembered that if he had drowned Camille, it was to marry Thérèse and work no more. Certainly the thought of having his sweetheart all to himself had greatly influenced him in committing the crime, but he had perhaps been led to it still more by the hope of taking the place of Camille, of being looked after in the same way, and of enjoying constant beatitude. Had passion alone urged him to the deed, he would not have shown such cowardice and prudence. The truth was that he had sought by murder to assure himself a calm, indolent life, and the satisfaction of his cravings. All these thoughts, avowedly or unconsciously, returned to him. To find encouragement, he repeated that it was time to gather in the harvest anticipated by the death of Camille, and he spread out before him the advantages and blessings of his future existence. He would leave his office and live in delicious idleness. He would eat, drink, and sleep to his heart's content. He would have an affectionate wife beside him, and he would shortly inherit the 40,000 francs and more of Madame Raquin, for the poor old woman was dying, little by little, every day. In a word, he would carve out for himself the existence of a happy brute, and would forget everything. Laurent mentally repeated these ideas at every moment, since his marriage with Thérèse had been decided on. He also sought other advantages that would result therefrom, and felt delighted when he found a new argument, drawn from his egotism, in favour of his union with the widow of the drowned man. But, however much he forced himself to hope, however much he dreamed of a future full of idleness and pleasure, he never ceased to feel abrupt shudders that gave his skin an icy chill, while at moments he continued to experience an anxiety that stifled his joy in his throat. End of chapter 18.